The man at the station didn't look like someone who was grieving. That was the first thing Deputy Earl Cobb noticed when he climbed off the westbound freight and spotted Harlan Price leaning against the far wall of Red Hollow Crossing's tiny platform office, boots crossed, hat tilted low, thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, like a man waiting on nothing more urgent than a card game. Cobb had ridden 40 miles specifically to warn Silas Granger. He was 2 steps onto the platform when Price pushed off the wall and blocked his path. "Sheriff's jurisdiction ends at the county line, Deputy." Price's voice was almost pleasant. "You know that. I'm not here on county business." "No." Price tilted his head and smiled with his mouth only. "You're here to stick your nose into mine, and I can't allow that." He said it so quietly that the 2 men flanking the freight door almost didn't move in time. Almost. If you've never seen a good man get beaten on a train platform in broad daylight while passengers looked away and pretended to study their luggage, then you've never understood how alone a person can be in a crowd. Earl Cobb hit the planking and didn't get up. Price straightened his vest, picked up the deputy's hat, set it gently on the bench beside the unconscious man, and walked off the platform like he'd simply concluded a piece of routine business. Nobody said a word. Nobody asked. And 12 miles away, Silas Granger was already saddling his horse, already counting the hours until Friday. He had no idea what was coming. If this kind of story moves something in you, the quiet kind of love that doesn't announce itself, the grief that doesn't quit, and the courage it takes to finally let go, then please subscribe to our channel and follow along to the very end. Stories like this one don't come with neat little warnings about where they'll break your heart. Hit the like button so we know you were here, and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. It means more than you know to see how far a story can travel. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow Crossing. Let's start from the beginning. The eastbound train arrived at Red Hollow Crossing every Friday at 2:30, and for 3 years running, Silas Granger had been sitting on the same bench when it did. Not the bench closest to the ticket window, not the one near the freight end with the roof overhang that kept the rain off better. The specific bench on the south side of the platform, third from the water barrel, where a man could see the full length of the track as it bent around the cottonwood grove and straightened out before the crossing. You could see the train from that bench a full 2 minutes before it arrived, which meant you could watch someone lean out a window long before the locomotive stopped. Silas had not explained this to anyone. He didn't particularly feel the need to explain himself to a town that had watched him bury his wife, sell off half his herd, and keep riding out here every Friday regardless. Red Hollow Crossing was not a town that pushed. It was a town that watched and waited and occasionally talked, but mostly it watched. He was 44 years old. He had wide hands, a jaw that hadn't been shaved as carefully as it used to be, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from a man who has decided not to feel too much in public. He wore the blue shirt on Fridays. Always the blue shirt. He'd bought it 4 years ago because Adeline had stood in the dry goods and held it up against his shoulder and said, "That's the one," with the particular certainty she applied to everything she said, and he had not been able to disagree with her since. He still couldn't. The platform ticket cost 5 cents. He bought one every Friday from whoever was working the window. He never boarded a train. He had not boarded a train in 3 years. He simply paid for the ticket, folded it into his shirt pocket, and sat. Old Deacon Marsh, who ran the freight desk and had seen everything a small railroad crossing could offer over 30 years of service, had long since stopped mentioning it. When newer hands asked, Deacon just shook his head in a way that closed the subject. "Leave the man be," was all he ever said. It had been enough. Until October. Vivian Hart arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a train day she was likely to forget, because the platform was empty when she stepped off, and the wind hit her so hard she dropped her traveling case and had to chase her hat 3 full yards down the planking before she caught it against a post. She stood there holding the hat against her head with one hand and her case with the other, looking at the small weathered station building, the single cottonwood rattling at the track's edge, and the sign above the door that said Red Hollow Crossing, population 340, as if that number were something to be proud of. She was 31 years old. She had chestnut hair she kept pinned back on the job and let down at night, blue eyes that missed very little, and a manner that people sometimes mistook for coldness because she didn't talk more than was necessary. She had grown up in Kansas City. She had worked 3 different rail lines over 7 years, advancing from general service to station accounting before the positions dried up in the city reorganizations of 1883, and she found herself with excellent references, a small savings, and no particular place she was required to be. Her mother had died in February, her father in June of the same year. There was nothing in Kansas City that required her return. The Red Hollow Crossing posting was a step backward in terms of position and a significant step backward in terms of pay, but it came with a room above the tax supply on Birch Street and the understanding that the previous clerk had left on poor terms, and the station manager, a man named Hiram Tully, needed someone reliable who would not cause him further problems. "I can be reliable," Vivian had told him in the letter. She had not mentioned the grief. There was no reason to. It didn't affect her work. Hiram Tully met her on the platform within 10 minutes of her arrival, slightly out of breath, wiping his hands on his vest in the manner of a man who has been doing something he'd rather not admit to. He was 50-something, balding, with the distracted look of someone managing 4 things simultaneously and doing none of them particularly well. "Miss Hart, good. Train was early." He shook her hand twice and picked up her case before she could protest. "I'll show you the window setup. We've had some trouble with the manifest system. Previous fellow let it get away from him. And the October freight accounts are something of a disaster. You're comfortable with ledgers? Yes? Good. Good." He was already walking. "The regulars are easy enough. Fridays get busy with the eastbound, but nothing you can't manage. There's one—" He paused, and something crossed his face that was difficult to read. "One regular you'll want to know about, rancher named Granger, Silas Granger. Comes every Friday, buys a platform ticket, sits on the south bench." Vivian waited. "Doesn't board," Tully said. "Doesn't cause any trouble, just sits." "All right." Tully looked at her as if he expected more of a reaction. When she gave none, he nodded once and kept walking. "Right. Well, just don't make a thing of it. The man's been through enough." She didn't ask what that meant. She assumed she'd find out eventually. She was right. The first Friday she watched him from the ticket window. She'd been warned, but watching was different from being warned. He came through the gate at 2:15, punctual, unhurried, wearing a blue shirt that had been pressed with some care and a hat that he held in his hand rather than wearing, which struck her as odd in the October wind. He set a nickel on the counter without breaking stride. "Platform ticket," he said. He didn't look at her directly. He was already looking past her toward the south side of the platform, orienting himself without seeming to think about it, the way a person navigates a room they know by heart. She stamped the ticket and slid it across. He took it, folded it once, the same fold she'd later notice, always the same fold, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Then he walked out to the bench and sat. He sat with his hat on his knee and his hands flat on his thighs. Not relaxed exactly, but settled, like a man who had made a decision and was living inside it. She watched the eastbound come in. She watched the passengers move through. A farm couple with 2 children, a traveling salesman with too many bags, an older woman who argued about her freight. And she watched Silas Granger watch the train windows. The way a man watches a door, he's half certain no one will come through. When the platform cleared, he stood. He put his hat on. He walked to the gate, nodded at her once, not quite meeting her eyes, and left. She stood at the window for a moment after he'd gone. Then she went back to the freight manifests, because the manifests were not going to fix themselves, and she had learned a long time ago that other people's grief was not hers to manage. What? The second Friday, she made coffee. She hadn't planned to. It was a cold morning. She'd made a pot for herself and Tully, and there was extra, and when she saw Granger's horse tied at the rail before the train arrived, she found herself filling a third cup without quite deciding to. She carried it out to the platform. He looked up when she set it on the bench beside him. His expression shifted in a way that was hard to describe, not exactly surprised, not exactly guarded, somewhere in between. "I didn't ask for that," he said. "No," Vivian agreed. "It's cold." She went back inside. She heard nothing for a moment. Then she heard him pick up the cup. When he left that afternoon, he left the cup on the counter beside the window, rinsed out. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She put the cup back on the shelf. Third Friday, she made the coffee before she'd finished her own. She set it on the bench before he arrived and was back at the window when he came through the gate. He stopped when he saw it, looked at the cup, looked at the ticket window. Then he sat down, picked it up, and drank. Hiram Tully watched this exchange from the freight doorway with an expression Vivian couldn't identify and didn't ask about. By the sixth Friday, they were talking. It started small. She'd asked, purely out of professional obligation, whether the November train schedule revisions would affect his ride. Many of the ranchers had concerns about the freight timing, and he had answered her actual question, carefully and directly, before asking in return whether she'd had any trouble with the water heater in the room above the tack supply, because the previous tenant had mentioned it was unreliable. "It's unreliable," she confirmed. "Tully knows about it," he said. "Tully knows about a lot of things he hasn't done anything about." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "That's been true since about 1879. It wasn't a laugh, but it was close enough. She found herself looking forward to Fridays in a way she hadn't expected when she took the position, and she found that mildly troubling, and she chose not to examine it too carefully because examination had not been her friend since February. The rainy Friday came in November. She'd meant to stay inside. The wind was doing something unpleasant off the plains, and the platform roof had a gap near the south end that turned every heavy rain into something more like a waterfall, and there was no practical reason to take coffee outside in those conditions. But she looked out and saw Silas Granger sitting in the only dry corner of the platform, collar up, water running off the brim of his hat, watching the tracks with the same fixed attention he brought every single week, rain or not. She poured 2 cups. She put on her work coat. She went out. He moved over without being asked. She sat. For a while, neither of them said anything. The rain hit the platform roof hard and irregular, and down the track the cottonwood was working itself into a visible panic, and somewhere behind the freight building a loose board was slamming in the wind. Then Vivian said, "Who are you waiting for?" She hadn't planned to ask. It simply came out. Perhaps because the rain made it easier to say things that were harder in clear weather. Perhaps because she'd been wondering since the first Friday and had run out of reasonable grounds for not asking. Silas was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He looked at the tracks. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he's having a conversation with himself about whether to have a different conversation with someone else. Then he said, "Her name was Adeline." He said it the way you say something that still costs you. Vivian didn't say anything. She held her coffee with both hands and let the sentence stand. We'd been married 11 years when her mother took sick, he said. Down in Wichita. She went to help. Thought it'd be a few weeks. Turned into 14 months. He paused. 14 months. And every Friday she'd come home for the weekend on the eastbound. I'd ride out here, He stopped again. She'd see me from the window before the train stopped and she'd laugh. The kind of laugh that He shook his head. She'd gather up her skirts and she'd be running before the locomotive stopped, down the platform. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "When did she die?" Vivian asked. Quiet. No edge to it, no apology, just a direct question from one person who knew about loss to another. 3 years ago, October. Heart. I'm sorry. Yeah. He looked at his coffee. She didn't make it back for it. The dying, I mean. It was fast. I went to her. He cleared his throat. Came back here the following Friday. Didn't know what else to do with the afternoon, if you want the truth. Vivian did want the truth. That was exactly what she wanted. And every Friday since, she said, every Friday since. The rain was letting up slightly. Down the track, the signal lamp was visible again, blurry through the wet. It's not like I think she'll be on the train, he said. And for the first time he sounded defensive, which suggested he'd had to explain this before, or had imagined explaining it and hadn't liked how it sounded. I'm not that far gone. I didn't say you were. People think it. Maybe. She turned the cup in her hands. Or maybe they just don't know what else to think because they haven't lost somebody they actually looked forward to seeing. He looked at her then. Actually looked at her, in a way he mostly hadn't since the first Friday, and she felt the weight of it. Not uncomfortable, just present. You've lost somebody, he said. Both my parents, she said. This year, 6 months apart. He didn't say he was sorry in a reflexive way. He sat with it for a moment first, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. That's a lot, he said finally. It is, she agreed. They sat through the end of the rain. When the eastbound came in and moved out again and the platform was quiet, he stood, put his hat on, picked up his cup. "Same time next Friday?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Coffee might be cold if the roof's still leaking," she said. "I've had cold coffee." He left. She stood on the platform listening to the water drip from the overhang and the rattle of the last freight car fading east, and she thought that grief was a strange and specific thing, and that sometimes you found it most unexpectedly in the place you were least looking for it. What she did not know was that Harlan Price had been watching the station since October. Price was not a Red Hollow man, which was part of why nobody in Red Hollow quite knew what to make of him on the 3 or 4 occasions he'd appeared in town. He owned, or claimed to own, the distinction was becoming legally significant, the Price Consolidated Grazing Concern, which had been buying up land along the east side of the county for 2 years under a series of contracts that, when examined carefully, had a way of looking quite different from how they'd looked when they were signed. Silas Granger's ranch, the Rocking G, sat on 340 acres of the best creek-fed grassland in the county. It bordered 2 parcels Price had already absorbed. It was, in the plainest possible terms, in the way. Silas had turned down 2 purchase offers. The first one politely, the second more directly. Price had sent a third offer in September, this one delivered not by his land agent but by a man named Cal Reeves, who rode for Price's outfit and had a habit of arriving places slightly before and slightly after things went wrong. Cal had handed Silas the envelope, held eye contact a few seconds longer than necessary, and said, "Mr. Price hopes you'll consider carefully this time." Silas had put the envelope in his stove without opening it. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone because Silas Granger was not the kind of man who asked for help before he needed it, and he had not yet quite arrived at needing it. That was the problem with being that kind of man. You sometimes didn't recognize needing it until it was already very late. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday in November, 2 days before Thanksgiving, when 3 of Silas's water troughs were found fouled. Deliberate, his ranch hand Eli confirmed. Not contamination by accident. The cattle had already been moved, as luck had it, or the losses would have been severe. As it was, it cost him 2 days of labor and a significant portion of his November operating budget. He reported it to the county sheriff, a man named Dowd, who was conscientious but operating with a jurisdiction that ended at a line Price's men were careful not to cross. Sheriff Dowd came out, looked at the troughs, wrote down what Silas told him, and said, "I can't prove a thing." "I know you can't," Silas said. "You might consider, I'm not selling." Dowd looked at him for a moment. "Silas, Price has money, and he has patience, and he has people working for him who don't mind doing things I can't prove. You need to think about whether this ranch is worth what it's going to cost you." "It was Adeline's ranch too," Silas said. "She planted the garden on the south side in the first spring we were here. Took her 3 weeks to get the soil right. I'm not selling." Dowd didn't argue. There wasn't anything useful to argue. That same week, Vivian was reorganizing the station's freight account ledgers, a project Tully had been pointedly avoiding, when she found the irregularity. It wasn't large. It was in fact quite small, a discrepancy in the freight transfer records from August, a tonnage figure that didn't match between the originating manifest and the Red Hollow receipt, and a notation in a handwriting she didn't recognize in the margin of the receipt book. The notation referenced a parcel number that didn't correspond to anything else in the records. She might have overlooked it. It was small enough to overlook. Instead, she set it aside and kept going through the ledgers, because in her experience, small discrepancies in freight records were almost never accidents, and she had 7 years of working rail lines and knowing what the books looked like when they were being used to move something that wasn't supposed to be moved. By Thursday, she had found 4 more. She did not yet know what any of it meant, but she was beginning to have a feeling she recognized from other ledgers in other stations in other cities, and the feeling was not a comfortable one. She locked the relevant pages in the station safe before she went home that night. She did not tell Hiram Tully because Hiram Tully's name appeared twice in the margin notation in the handwriting she didn't recognize. Friday arrived with a cold, clear sky and air that had real winter in it. Silas came through the gate at 2:15, same as always, and she set the coffee on the counter instead of carrying it out, because the wind was doing something she didn't want to fight with a full cup. He came to the window. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "You're inside today." "It's January weather in November," she said. "The platform can wait." He picked up the coffee. Something about him was different today. Held tighter, she thought. The stillness was still there, but it was the stillness of a man who'd been clenching something instead of setting it down. "Hard week?" she said. He considered not answering. She could see him weigh it. "Somebody fouled my water supply," he said. "Troughs. Cost me 2 days and most of my November budget." "Accident?" He looked at her, and the look said everything the word didn't. "No," she said. "No." He drank the coffee. "I've got a neighbor problem, the kind that buys things." She waited. "Harlan Price. You heard of him?" She shook her head. "You will," Silas said, and his voice was flat in a way that made the words sound more like a warning than a prediction. "He wants my land. I won't sell. He's working on making that decision harder for me." Through the window behind him, she could see the cottonwood shaking in the wind, and further out the bend in the track where the train would appear. And somewhere in her chest was the beginning of a thing she hadn't felt in most of a year. Something that was not quite worry for herself, which she'd gotten used to, but something sharper and more personal than that. "Is it working?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Ask me in spring," he said. The eastbound was visible now, around the bend, the dark shape resolving out of the winter light, and she watched him turn to look at it, the automatic turn, the old habit. And she watched his face do the thing she'd seen every Friday, the thing she had not had a word for but was beginning to understand. It was not hope, exactly. It was the habit of hope. The place the heart kept going even after the mind knew better. She understood that more than she wanted to. When the train had come and gone and the platform was empty again, he set the cup on the counter and said, "Thank you for the coffee." "Same time next week," she said. He nodded once and went. She locked the safe. She looked at the ledger pages inside it. She thought about Harlan Price, a man she'd never met, and the name in the margin that belonged to the man she worked for. And she thought about 340 acres of creek-fed grassland belonging to a man who could not afford to lose another month like November. Then she put on her coat and walked home in the cold, clear winter air, thinking that Red Hollow Crossing was not at all the simple, quiet life she had come here expecting, and that she was not, perhaps, as finished with complicated things as she'd hoped. The following Monday, Cal Reeves came through the station. She knew him by the way he moved before she knew his name. The way some men move through a public space like they're measuring it, like they're deciding what each piece of it is worth and whether they might want it later. He was dark-haired, lean, somewhere in his 30s, with a pleasantness about his face that never quite reached his eyes. He bought a through ticket to Dodge City. He leaned on the counter while she processed it. "You're the new clerk," he said. "I am," Vivian said. "Miss Hart." "Miss Hart." He smiled. "You settling in all right? Red Hollow treating you well?" She stamped the ticket and slid it across. "Train's at 3:15. Right. He picked up the ticket but didn't move away from the counter. "I've got some freight I'd like to route through here in the next few weeks. Price consolidated business. I expect we might be seeing a good deal of each other." She met his eyes and held them with the same expression she'd learned to use in 7 years of handling men who thought a ticket counter made you someone they could talk down to. "We process freight at the freight desk," she said. "Mondays and Thursdays. Talk to Mr. Tully." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he straightened, tucked the ticket in his pocket, and smiled again with the pleasantness that didn't reach anything. "Pleasure, Miss Hart." He walked to the platform. She watched him go and thought about locked safes, and thought about the name in the margin, and thought about a man who came every Friday and sat on a bench and had just had his water supply fouled by people who were currently buying tickets through her window. She thought, "I need to understand what's in those freight records before someone realizes I found them." She thought, "I have been trying to live a quiet life." She thought, "That may not be possible here." The letter from St. Louis arrived the same week. She hadn't applied for the position. She had not applied for any position since taking the Red Hollow posting, because she was, for the first time in 2 years, not actively running from anything, and that itself had been a kind of relief. But she had been recommended by a former supervisor, the letter said, and the regional management role was newly created, and if she was interested in submitting a formal application, the position was hers to lose rather than to win. The salary was nearly double what Red Hollow paid. She set the letter on her table above the tax supply and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the safe. She thought about the freight manifests. She thought about Hiram Tully's name in the margin. She thought about a blue shirt and a folded platform ticket and coffee on a bench in November rain. She did not decide anything that night. She was not a person who made decisions the night she received information. She made them after she'd thought long enough to be certain, and she was not certain, not yet. Eli rode into the Rocking G on a Thursday with news that reset everything. Eli was 22, had worked the ranch for 3 years, and was not given to dramatics. When he came through the barn door with that particular set to his mouth that meant something had gone genuinely wrong, Silas put down the harness he'd been mending and waited. "There's a man," Eli said, "on the east fence line. Surveying? Running stakes." Silas was out of the barn before Eli finished the sentence. The east fence line of the Rocking G ran along a ridge that served as the natural boundary between his property and the land Price had absorbed in the spring, and the ridge itself, and the access road that ran along it, was common-use territory, designated in the original county survey records as uncontested rangeway. But the man Silas found at the fence line was not surveying rangeway. He was planting stakes 8 feet inside the Rocking G's fence, in ground that had been Rocking G ground since 1871, with a confidence that suggested he believed the papers in his coat pocket supported him doing exactly that. Silas pulled the nearest stake out of the ground. The surveyor looked up. "I'd put that back," the man said. "Those are legal markers. They're on my land." "According to a survey filed in Dodge City last week," the man said, pulling a folded document from his coat with the care of someone who expected it to end an argument, "the eastern boundary of Price Consolidated's Lot 14 runs." Silas took the paper, read the first 3 lines, and handed it back. "That survey is wrong," he said. "The county recorder accepted it." "The county recorder," Silas said, in the careful tone of a man controlling something much louder, "accepted it because somebody gave it to him and didn't give him anything to compare it against." "Mr. Granger, you're going to take your stakes and your papers and get off my land," Silas said. "And you're going to tell whoever sent you that I'll be in Dodge City on Monday morning with my original deed and the 1871 survey, and I will stand in front of every county official I can find until somebody explains to me how a line that's been in the same place for 12 years moved 8 feet in the last week." The surveyor looked at him for a long moment. Then he began pulling his stakes. Silas stood there until the man had packed up and ridden off the property, and then he stood there a little longer, in the cold wind on the east ridge, looking at the indentations in the frozen ground where the stakes had been. He thought about the fouled troughs. He thought about the third offer, the one he'd burned. He thought about Cal Reeves and Price Consolidated and the way a man like Price worked, the way money worked when it had patience, the way it wore things down instead of breaking them, the way it falsified surveys and spoiled water supplies, and waited for a man to get tired enough to sell. He was not tired, he was angry. There was a significant difference. He rode back to the house. He wrote a letter to a land attorney in Dodge City he'd met twice and trusted once. He asked the attorney to be available Monday morning with whatever expertise was relevant to falsified county surveys and improper boundary claims. Then he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, in the house Adeline had called home, looking at the south window where in spring the garden would come back around. It always came back, she'd planted it to come back, and he thought about what it would mean to lose this place. He decided it would mean a great deal more than he was willing to accept. He wrote a second letter, this one to Sheriff Dowd, this one considerably less polite than the first. On Friday, she could tell something had shifted the moment he came through the gate. He was still wearing the blue shirt, he was still punctual. But he moved differently, not heavier, which was what grief looked like on him. She'd learned to read that. This was something else. He moved like a man who'd made a decision and was living on the forward edge of it. She already had the coffee ready. She'd been watching for his horse. He came to this window. He didn't pick up the coffee right away. "Somebody filed a false survey last week," he said without preamble, "trying to move my east boundary line 8 feet into my property." She kept her face neutral. "What are you going to do?" "Fight it. Monday, Dodge City." He picked up the coffee. His hands were steady. "It's Price, has to be. He's trying to establish a contested boundary before I can respond." The freight manifest sat in the locked safe 6 feet behind her. She thought about them, about what was in them and what it might mean, and whether what she suspected was actually what she thought she suspected. She thought about the letter from St. Louis. She said, "How much do you know about Price's freight operations?" He looked at her. "Why?" he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then said, "I've been looking at some station records, older freight manifests. There are some irregularities. I don't know what they mean yet, but they involve price-consolidated shipments, and they involve the name of someone here at the station." His eyes sharpened. "Tully?" She didn't answer that directly. She said, "I locked the relevant pages in the safe on Thursday night." He set the coffee down. "Vivian," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name without the title, and she noticed, and she thought he probably didn't realize he'd done it. "Those records, if they show what you think they show, I don't know yet what they show. But if they do..." He leaned slightly toward the window. "That's dangerous. Price doesn't... He plays these things carefully, but he plays them serious. The man who came to deliver his last offer to me, Cal Reeves." Something passed over his face. "You've met him." "He was through the station Monday, buying a ticket." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing that. "Vivian, I need you to be careful. If Price thinks you found something, he doesn't know what I found," she said. "I haven't told Tully. I haven't told anyone." "You're telling me." "I'm telling you," she agreed. The eastbound was coming around the cottonwood bend, visible now through the window behind him, the dark shape pulling its freight out of the winter distance. He turned to look at it, the old automatic turn, and then he turned back to her, and for a moment the two things were in his face at once, the old grief and the new sharp thing that wasn't grief at all, but something much more present. "Monday I go to Dodge City," he said. "When I'm back I want to look at what you found." "Monday's a freight desk day," she said. "I can have what I need copied by then." "Be careful between now and Monday." She met his eyes. "I'm always careful." He almost smiled. "Not quite, but almost." "That's not the same thing." The train came in, the platform filled and emptied. He watched the windows the way he always watched the windows, and she watched him watch them, and neither of them spoke for that part of it, because that part was his. When the eastbound departed and the platform was quiet again, he set the cup on the counter. "Same time next week," he said. "Coffee might actually be warm for once," she said, "if this wind lets up." He put on his hat. He walked to the gate. He stopped. He turned around. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the coffee." Then he was gone. She stood at the window until she couldn't hear his horse anymore. Then she went to the safe, unlocked it, and began making copies of everything she'd found, in her own careful handwriting, on paper she would keep somewhere Hiram Tully would never think to look. Outside, the last light was going off the Kansas plain in long gold strips, and somewhere east of the cottonwood, the freight line ran straight and flat into the dark, and Red Hollow Crossing sat in the middle of all of it, very small, very quiet, and considerably more complicated than it had appeared on the Wednesday she'd stepped off the train and chased her hat 3 yards down the platform. She was not, she thought, finished with complicated things at all. She might, in fact, be just getting started. She finished copying the last page at 9:30 that night, by lamplight, sitting at the small table in her room above the tax supply with the wind pushing against the window glass and the smell of leather and sawdust coming up through the floorboards. She had 7 pages of copied figures. She had 4 separate freight manifest entries that didn't reconcile. She had 2 notations in the margin of the receipt book that referenced parcel numbers corresponding to nothing in the official log. And she had Hiram Tully's name, not his signature, not his initials, just his name, written in someone else's handwriting beside a tonnage figure that was 40 pounds lighter on the receiving end than it had been when it left its point of origin. 40 pounds was not a rounding error. She folded the copies into thirds, wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth she'd bought at the dry goods that afternoon, on the pretense of needing something to protect her ledger covers from the damp, and put the package at the bottom of her traveling case beneath her winter wool. Then she relocked the case, set it against the wall under her spare boots, and sat there for a moment with her hands in her lap. She was not frightened. She was something more specific than frightened. She was alert in the way that precedes fear, when a person is still in the phase of being careful rather than the phase of being cornered. She'd been in the second phase once in Kansas City, when she'd found a discrepancy in a freight ledger at a much larger station and had made the mistake of mentioning it to her supervisor before she understood what she was dealing with. That particular supervisor had not been listed in any margin, but he had transferred her to a smaller station within the week, and the discrepancy had vanished from the records. She had learned from that. The lesson was, know what you have before you tell anyone what you have. Know who you can trust before you decide what to do with what you know. Don't move until you understand the whole shape of the thing. She understood only a part of the shape so far, but the part she understood was enough to make her careful. She blew out the lamp and lay on the cot and listened to the wind and thought about Silas Granger riding to Dodge City on Monday morning with his deed and his 1871 survey, and thought about how a man fighting a falsified boundary claim had no idea that 6 miles away, in a locked railroad safe, there might be freight records that spoke directly to how Harlan Price had managed to file documents in a county office without resistance. She thought, those two things might be connected. She thought, they very probably were. She went to sleep with that thought, which was not a comfortable thought to sleep with, but was better than not having it. Saturday, Hiram Tully came to the station when Vivian was in the middle of cross-referencing the November freight receipts, the legitimate ones, the ones that were simply behind. And he stood in the doorway to the back office for a moment before she noticed him, which meant he'd been watching her work, which she noted without commenting on it. Catching up the November accounts, he said. Almost through them, she said. Good, good. He came in, picked up the edge of a manifest she wasn't currently using, and set it down again. October's all settled, then? October's filed. Right. He lingered. This was unusual. Tully was not, as a general principle, someone who lingered in the accounts office. He managed the station with the slightly overwhelmed competence of a man who preferred to be out talking to freight handlers rather than in dealing with paper. His presence here, on a Saturday, watching her work, had a quality she didn't care for. Everything looks straight to you? He said. Casual. Almost too casual. She looked up from the ledger. She kept her face exactly as interested as it would be if she'd been asked about the weather. Mostly, she said, there's some slippage in the August tonnage records I'm still working out, old filing inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic. He nodded slowly. Old records can get muddy. Previous clerk wasn't the most careful. So I've noticed, she said, and went back to the current page. He stood there another moment. Then he said, let me know if anything looks out of place. Of course, she said. He left. She heard his footsteps go down the hall and out through the freight door. She sat very still for a moment. Then she went back to the November accounts because they were real and they needed finishing, and because sitting very still for too long when someone was watching was its own kind of signal. She did not look frightened. She was not going to look frightened. But that evening she added a second oilcloth packet to the bottom of the traveling case, this one containing the copies she'd made of the August manifest pages themselves. Not just her own notes, but the actual transcribed figures, in her own handwriting, line by line exact. If the originals disappeared, she would still have what she'd seen. Sunday she spent at the rooming house. She rewrote her notes in a cleaner hand, organized by date and parcel number, building a sequence that a person unfamiliar with freight accounting could still follow. She thought about who that person might need to be. A county official, possibly. A land attorney, possibly. She thought about the attorney in Dodge City that Silas had mentioned in passing, the one he was riding to see Monday. She thought about whether the freight records and the boundary claim were part of the same construction, the same patient, money-backed pressure. She was fairly certain they were. The timing was too specific. The August records were the point at which Price Consolidated's expansion into the eastern county parcels had accelerated, 2 purchases completed in September, a third in October, and then the fouled troughs at the Rocking G in November, and the boundary survey the following week. It was not the pattern of a man who wanted land. It was the pattern of a man who was acquiring it in a specific sequence, and who had arranged for the paperwork infrastructure to support that sequence at a county level, and who had someone inside the station helping him move freight in ways the official records didn't reflect. 40 pounds per shipment might not mean much in isolation. Multiplied over 6 months of irregular freight transfers, organized, documented, used to establish false tonnage records that could be used to support false property assessments. She stopped herself. She was getting ahead of the evidence. She had what she had. She needed to be careful about building theories from what she didn't yet know. She organized what she did know. She put it in order. She made it clear. She wrote at the top of the first clean page, in her plainest handwriting, freight irregularities, Red Hollow Crossing Station, August through October 1883, compiled by V. Hart, station clerk. She looked at it, Then she wrote the date. Then she put the papers away and went to bed. Monday morning, she was at the station before Tully arrived, which was not unusual. She was generally first in, and she unlocked the safe and confirmed that the original pages were where she'd left them. They were. She locked the safe again, put the key in her skirt pocket, and had the coffee on by the time the first freight handler arrived at 7. Tully came in at 15:15. He looked at the safe, briefly, in the way of a man who isn't trying to look at something. Then he looked at the accounts desk and said, "November all finished?" "Filed this morning," she said. "Good." He went to his office. She processed the Monday freight. She stamped invoices. She handled a complaint from a wool merchant about delayed shipment dates. She made a second pot of coffee and didn't offer Tully any, and he didn't ask for any, which was how she knew the Sunday conversation had changed something between them, even though neither of them had said anything Sunday worth changing. At 10:30, Cal Reeves came in. He was not carrying luggage this time. He was not buying a ticket. He went directly to Tully's office door, knocked twice, and went in without waiting for a response. Vivian processed a freight invoice and did not look up. She heard voices, low, through the closed door. Not the words but the register, Tully's higher pitch and Reeves's even, measured tone, and once a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. They were in there for 22 minutes. She counted, because counting was something to do besides appear to listen. When Reeves came out, he crossed the main room toward the door and stopped at the counter. "Miss Hart," he said. Pleasant, that same pleasantness. "Mr. Reeves." "Quiet Monday." "Freight Mondays usually are," she said. "Most of the activities at the desk by noon." He set both hands on the counter. Easy, casual, like a man with nowhere to be. "Mr. Tully says you've been doing excellent work getting the old accounts in order." "It's part of the job," she said. "Old records can be complicated. Lots of entries, lots of cross-referencing." He was watching her in a way that was almost friendly. Almost. Easy to misread things if you don't know the full context. She looked up from the invoice she was stamping. She met his eyes directly. "I generally ask questions when I need context," she said. "Of course." He smiled. "That's the professional approach, asking the right people the right questions." He let that sit for just a second too long. "Well, I'll let you get back to it." He left. She stamped the invoice. Her hand was entirely steady, which was something she was specifically choosing, and the choice required a small amount of effort, which she did not show. She thought, "He knows I've been in the old records. He doesn't know what I found. He's trying to find out whether I found something or whether I'm a problem yet." She thought, "I need to not be a problem yet." She finished the morning freight. At noon, she took her lunch at the desk instead of stepping out, because stepping out felt like leaving the safe unattended in a way she wasn't comfortable with. She ate a biscuit she'd brought from the rooming house and drank water and read through the December shipping schedule as if it were the most absorbing document in the county. At 2:30, a rider came through who wasn't a freight customer or a ticket buyer. He was young, mid-20s, with trail dust on his coat and the particular look of someone who'd ridden hard and recently. He came to the window and said, "Message for Miss Hart." She took the folded paper. She waited until he'd gone before she opened it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the note was short and direct. "Arrived Dodge City. Attorney confirms the survey filing is irregular. Records suggest additional documentation may exist establishing Price's pattern. Can you be in Dodge City Thursday? Tell no one. SG." She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk, picked up her pen and wrote Thursday. Personal day, at the bottom of the December schedule, in pencil. As if she were making a note to herself, which she was. Then she burned Silas's note in the small stove she used to heat the office and went back to work. Tuesday and Wednesday, she behaved exactly as she always behaved, which was the most important thing she could do. She arrived first. She made coffee. She processed freight. She stamped invoices, fielded complaints, updated the December schedule, and answered every question Tully asked her with the exact degree of helpfulness she'd been showing since October. She made no copies of anything. She opened the safe twice, once on Monday for a legitimate freight receipt, once on Tuesday because she needed a previous month's figures, and both times she felt Tully's awareness of the moment like a pressure at the back of her neck, and both times she closed it again with the same unremarkable efficiency she applied to everything. She was playing a part she happened to be good at. Invisible competence. The person who keeps the place running so smoothly that no one remembers to watch her. Wednesday evening, she packed a small bag. Winter dress, traveling coat, the oilcloth packets at the bottom. She told her landlady she'd be visiting a cousin in Dodge City for 2 days. Her landlady, a woman named Mrs. Aberley, who was significantly more interested in the rooming house accounts than in her tenants' personal lives, said fine, fine, without looking up from her own ledger. She walked to the stable and arranged a seat on the Thursday morning mail coach. It left at 6. She'd be in Dodge City by early afternoon. She did not tell Tully. She left a note on the accounts desk saying she'd taken a personal day and that the freight manifests for Thursday were already prepared and filed in the left drawer. She went to bed early and did not sleep particularly well, and thought about Silas Granger sitting in a Dodge City attorney's office with a 12-year-old deed and a survey that someone had been trying to bury, and she thought about 40 pounds of freight, and she thought about the particular patience of a man with enough money to wait while a rancher wore himself down. She thought, Price is not going to stop. He doesn't stop when people say no. He just changes methods. She thought, the question is whether there's enough documentation to stop him before he changes methods again. The mail coach was cold, and the road was hard, and the man across from her slept with his mouth open the entire 4 hours, but Vivian didn't mind any of it. She had her bag on her lap and her notes in her head, and the clear, cold air of a December plains morning coming through the gap in the coach curtain, and she felt more purposeful than she had in a long time. Not happy exactly, but directed, which was a thing she'd always needed more than happiness, and was better at recognizing when she had it. Silas was waiting outside the attorney's office on the main street when the coach arrived. He'd seen her before she'd quite gotten her bag down from the roof rack, and he'd crossed the street and was there when she turned around. He looked like he'd been awake since before she had, which, considering she'd left at 6, meant something about how seriously he was taking the Dodge City trip. "You made it," he said. "I said Thursday," she said. "It's Thursday." He almost smiled. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, a tension that was sharper than the contained grief, less settled, more like the face of a man in the middle of something rather than one who had made peace with something. "Attorney's name is Hartwell," he said, already turning toward the office. "He's been in county land law 20 years. He's good. He's also—" A slight pause. "He's going to have questions." "All right," she said. Hartwell was 60, compact, with the kind of attentive stillness in his face that good lawyers develop when they're actually listening rather than waiting to speak. He shook her hand, looked at the oilcloth packet she set on his desk, and said, "Mr. Granger tells me you found some freight records." "I found discrepancies in freight records," she said. "I want to be careful about the distinction." "Understood." Hartwell opened a notepad. "Tell me what you found." She told him, completely, in order, the way she'd organized the notes. She laid the copies out on the desk as she went. She watched his face move from polite professional attention to something more concentrated, and she watched Silas in the chair beside her watching Hartwell's face shift, and she thought that Silas understood enough about what he was seeing to know it was significant before Hartwell said a word. When she finished, Hartwell sat back. "The tonnage discrepancies on their own," he said slowly, "are suggestive but not conclusive. What's significant is the parcel numbering system." He tapped one of her copied pages. "These codes, I've seen a version of this before. It's a shadow routing system. Freight that enters official records at point of origin gets partially rerouted at an intermediate station and then appears complete at destination. The 40-pound difference per shipment isn't about weight. It's about what's in those 40 pounds. Silas leaned forward. "What was in them?" Hartwell turned to him. "Documents, most likely. Signed documents. Contracts, deeds, survey authorizations. The kind of paperwork that establishes legal standing for land transactions that might not otherwise have that standing." He paused. "In other words, someone has been using the Red Hollow freight system to move legal documents connected to Price's land acquisitions without those documents appearing in any official transit record." The room was quiet for a moment. "That explains why the county records look clean," Silas said. "It explains why they look clean," Hartwell agreed. "It doesn't explain where the originals came from or what names are on them, but if Miss Hart's freight records can be corroborated by the actual transit logs—" "The originals are in the station safe," Vivian said. "Locked. I have the key." Both men looked at her. "They'll move on those records the moment they know what we're doing," she said. Tully's already suspicious, and Reeves came into the station Monday specifically to assess whether I was a problem. He said that? Silas said. He didn't say it in words, she said. Hartwell was already writing. If we can get a writ of preservation on those station records before Tully or anyone connected to Price can access them, we lock down the originals legally. That requires a county judge. I have a relationship with Judge Egan in this district. He looked up. It will take until tomorrow morning. I need to be back at the station tomorrow morning, Vivian said. I know, Hartwell said. Can you get back in this afternoon and behave normally for the next 16 hours? She thought about the safe. She thought about Cal Reeves's hands on the counter. She thought about the pleasantness in his face that never reached his eyes. Yes, she said. Then that's what we do. Hartwell stood. Mr. Granger, I'll have the boundary challenge formally filed by end of day. We have enough in the original 1871 survey to challenge the county recorder's acceptance of the Price filing, and that challenge will require a hearing. That buys us time. He turned to Vivian. Miss Hart, those station records are critical. As long as they exist in that safe, we have leverage. The moment they disappear, we have a much harder problem. They won't disappear, she said. She said it with more certainty than she felt, which was something she'd learned to do in 7 years of working with ledgers that people wanted to make disappear. The mail coach back left at 3 and she was on it, bag on her lap, watching the flat plains move past in the thin winter light. Beside her, a farm woman with 2 small children was managing a basket, a hat box, and a child who kept climbing toward the window, and Vivian spent a portion of the ride catching the child when he slid sideways on turns, which gave her something to do besides calculate exactly how many things could go wrong in the next 16 hours. She got back to Red Hollow at dusk. She went to the rooming house, changed out of her traveling clothes, and walked to the station because she'd told herself she'd walk past it, just to confirm it looked normal from the outside. It looked normal from the outside. She went back to her room. She put the oilcloth packets back in the traveling case. She ate the bread and cold beans Mrs. Aberley had left on the kitchen table for late arrivals. She washed her face. She sat on the cot with her hands in her lap and did not let herself think too specifically about what happened if Tully went for the safe tonight before Hartwell could file the writ. She thought instead about Silas Granger in Hartwell's office, leaning forward when Hartwell explained the shadow routing, the way he understood immediately what it meant for his land, the way he'd been fighting this thing alone for months, the troughs, the survey, the offers he'd burned, without asking anyone for help, without telling anyone what was happening, doing the math quietly in his own head, and showing up every Friday in a blue shirt because that was the thing he could still do. She thought about him saying, I'm not going to lose the woman who still can, except he hadn't said that yet and wouldn't for another several months. But she thought about the version of him that would say it, and she thought that she was already beginning to understand why he would, because something was being built between Fridays that neither of them had designed or discussed or particularly planned. She was too tired and too alert at the same time to decide what she thought about that, so she went to sleep instead. Friday morning came cold and clear. She was at the station at 6:30. She unlocked the safe immediately. The pages were there. She relocked it, exhaled something that wasn't quite a breath she'd been holding since Dodge City, and put on the coffee. Tully came in at 7:15. He looked at the safe. He looked at her. He said, "Back from your personal day." "Everything's in order," she said. "I left the Thursday manifests filed." "I saw." He poured himself coffee without being invited, which was unusual only in that he'd been waiting to see if she'd offer. "Hartwell's office sent a wire this morning." She kept her hand steady on the coffee pot. "Did they?" she said. "To the county recorder. Apparently there's a formal challenge to the Price Consolidated Survey filing." Tully looked into his cup. "Related to the Rocking G boundary claim." "I see." He looked at her. It was the longest, most direct look he'd given her since she'd started at the station, and there was something in it that was not quite accusation but was in the neighborhood of it. "Granger's a good man," Tully said finally. "Hard life lately." She didn't say anything. "People around here respect him," Tully continued. "Adeline's passing hit the whole county, if you want to know. She was—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "She was the kind of woman who remembered your name. Every person she met, remembered their birthday, their children's names, that kind of thing." Vivian waited. Tully set his cup down. I want you to know, he said, that I didn't understand what was in those freight transfers. When Price's people came to me, it was presented as a routing efficiency. Reduced paperwork, they said. I didn't. He stopped again. His hands moved on the counter like a man sorting through something he'd rather not sort through. I didn't ask enough questions. The room was quiet for a moment. Mr. Tully, she said carefully, if someone from a legal office in Dodge City were to contact you about those freight records, the August and September transfers in particular, would you cooperate? His jaw moved. I have a wife, he said. I have a daughter in Hayes City. I know, she said, though she hadn't known about the daughter until that moment. Price is not a man you cross without consequences. No, she agreed. He's not. Another silence, longer. The records in that safe, he said. Yes. If those records were to be reviewed by the appropriate people with the appropriate legal standing, a writ of preservation is being filed today, she said quietly. By end of morning, those records are legally protected. No one can remove or alter them without a court order. Tully looked at her. He had the face of a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a long time and had recently begun to feel the possibility of setting it down. You've been busy, he said. I do accurate work, she said. It's what you hired me for. He picked up his cup. He went back toward his office. At the doorway, he stopped. The safe key, he said. Keep it. She nodded once. He went in and closed the door. She stood at the counter and breathed carefully for a moment. Then she checked the clock. 2:15. She put the second pot on for the afternoon. Silas came through the gate at exactly 1:30, and the particular quality of his arrival was different today. He still wore the blue shirt, still carried himself with the contained stillness she'd learned to read, but there was something fractionally lighter about him, or maybe not lighter, but less compressed, like a man who had spent a long time under pressure and had just heard the first news that the pressure might eventually ease. She had his coffee ready. He came to the window. He saw her face and said immediately, "The records?" "Safe," she said. "Writ should be filed by noon. Tully—" She paused, choosing words. "Tully is going to cooperate." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "You're sure?" "He told me to keep the safe key." Something moved across his face. It wasn't relief exactly. Relief was what you felt when something was over, and this was far from over. But it was the recognition that the ground under him was more solid than it had been yesterday. "Hartwell's filed the boundary challenge," he said. "Hearing set for January 14th. County Judge, Dodge City." He picked up the coffee. "They're going to push back. Price has people on his side in that courthouse. He also has freight records in this station that can be subpoenaed," she said. He nodded slowly. A woman came to the window for a ticket. Through to Wichita, one way. And Vivian sold it and made change and said, "Have a safe trip without breaking the quality of her own attention," which was something she was good at. And when the woman moved away, she looked back at Silas. I was looking at her in a way that had shifted from the way he usually looked at her, which was directly but with a kind of careful management to it, like a man keeping track of where things were and making sure not to let them slide somewhere inconvenient. This was more like the moment just before careful management fails. "You went to Dodge City," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "You needed the freight records contextualized," she said. "I was the person who understood them." "That's not the only reason you went." She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." He didn't push it. He was not, she'd come to understand, a man who pushed things. He was a man who showed up. Consistently, punctually, in the blue shirt, with the folded ticket, in the rain and the cold and the wind, and he let the showing up speak for him because he'd learned somewhere along the way that showing up was the truest language he had. She understood that, more than she'd expected to understand anything about another person this year. The eastbound came around the bend at 2:47. He turned to watch it the way he always turned, the automatic orienting, the old alignment of himself toward the track. And this time she didn't look away from his face when he did it. She watched him watch the windows. She watched his jaw tighten slightly and then ease. She watched the train come in and stop and disgorge its passengers and take on 3 new ones and blow its whistle and pull away east. She watched him let go of something that had been held very tightly, The way you let go of things you've been holding so long you've stopped feeling the weight. And then suddenly the weight is gone and you feel the absence of it, which is its own particular sensation. He stood there for another moment after the train was gone. Then he turned back to the window. January 14th, he said there, the hearing. I'll be there, she said. He looked surprised. You don't have to. I'm the one who found the records, she said. I'll need to testify about the freight manifests. Yes, technically, that's true. He was doing something with his expression that she'd come to recognize as suppressed something. She wasn't yet sure what. Hartwell will want a statement. He already has one, she said. I wrote it out before I left Dodge City. Silas set down the empty cup. He shook his head once, slowly, in the manner of a man who has found himself genuinely surprised by another person, which did not happen to him frequently and which he was not entirely sure what to do with. Miss Hart, he said. Vivian, she said. A pause. Vivian, he said, and said it the way he'd said it on Friday when he hadn't quite realized he was saying it, like something that had been there long enough to be natural. Thank you. For all of it. Not just the records. The platform was quiet behind him. The last freight car was a sound fading east. The cottonwood at the track edge was doing something bare-limbed and elegant in the late afternoon light, the way cottonwoods did in winter, stripped down to their essential shape. She thought, I came here to be quiet. I came here to be finished with complicated things. She thought, I am not finished. I am in fact somewhere near the beginning. Same time next week, she said. He picked up his hat. Same time, he agreed. He walked to the gate. She watched him go. She watched him mount up, straight-backed in the winter light, and she watched him ride west toward 340 acres of creek-fed grassland and a garden on the south side that always came back in spring. Then she went to the safe, confirmed the lock, pocketed the key, and began closing up the station for the weekend. Outside, the December light was going gold and thin over the plains, and somewhere between Red Hollow Crossing and the Rocking G, the road ran straight and cold and clear, and the distance between them was 12 miles, which was not very far at all when you thought about it correctly. The writ of preservation arrived at Red Hollow Crossing Station on a Friday morning, delivered by a county courier who handed it to Vivian at the window, with the particular indifference of a man whose job was moving paper from one place to another and who had no interest in what the paper contained. She signed for it. She read it. She locked it in the safe with the freight manifests. Then she made the coffee. Hiram Tully came in at his usual time, saw the courier's receipt on the counter, picked it up, read it, set it down. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Judge Egan's stamp. Yes, she said. That's a serious judge. Hartwell seems to think so. Tully set the receipt down carefully, the way you set down something you're not sure how to hold. Price is going to know by this afternoon, he said. His people watched the county wire. I expect so, she said. He looked at her. You're not worried. I'm careful, she said. There's a difference. He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite anything else, poured his coffee, and went to his office. She heard him close the door. Not hard, just closed. And she stood at the counter and thought that Tully was the kind of man who made poor decisions not out of greed, but out of the particular cowardice of someone who had too much to lose and not enough backbone to protect it cleanly. She'd known men like that her whole career. They weren't villains. They were something more frustrating. They were weak in exactly the moments that required them not to be. But he told her to keep the safe key. That counted for something. She turned to the window and watched the December morning move across the platform, the light low and white, and casting no shadows worth mentioning, and she thought about January 14th, 26 days. The second week of December brought weather that changed everyone's plans, including Harlan Price's. 3 days of hard freeze followed by a thaw, followed by another freeze left the eastern county roads nearly impassable, which meant freight was backed up, which meant the station was busier than it had any right to be in December, which meant Vivian was at the window from 7 in the morning until past 6 at night processing backlogged manifests and rerouted shipments and a steady rotation of frustrated freight customers who all believed their cargo was the most urgent. She was good at managing frustrated people. She'd had 7 years of practice and a natural temperament that didn't take frustration personally, which was rarer than it sounded. She listened. She gave direct answers. She found solutions when solutions existed and told the truth when they didn't. Most people, even frustrated ones, responded well to that. Cal Reeves was not most people. He came through on a Wednesday afternoon, the second week of December, when the platform was crowded with rerouted freight and Tully was out dealing with a loading dispute at the far end, and Vivian was managing the window alone. Reeves didn't wait in the line that had formed. He came around the side of the crowd with the ease of a man who did not experience himself as someone who waited in lines. He set an envelope on the counter. "Freight authorization," he said. "3 crates, price consolidated, routing through to Wichita. I need them on the Thursday eastbound." She picked up the envelope without opening it. "Thursday eastbound is full. I can get you on Saturday or next Tuesday." "Thursday." She looked up from the envelope. "I said Thursday is full." "I heard what you said." He held eye contact with a pleasantness that had a particular edge to it today, something she hadn't felt in the previous conversations. "Look a little harder at the manifest. I think you'll find space." "Mr. Reeves." She kept her voice exactly level. "The Thursday eastbound manifest is at capacity as of this morning. I have 11 other freight customers on the wait list for that slot. I can offer you Saturday or Tuesday." A pause. He looked at the envelope she was holding. He looked at the safe behind her, which was not subtle and was not intended to be. Then he looked at her. "You've been doing a lot of extra work lately," he said, "going through old records, making trips to Dodge City." The pleasantness dropped the pretense of being warm. It was still there on his face, but it was performing itself now rather than actually residing there. That kind of extra effort can make things complicated for a person. She set the envelope back on the counter and slid it toward him. "Saturday or Tuesday," she said. "Those are your options." He stood there for another moment. Then he picked up the envelope and left. She processed the next 3 freight customers without a pause. When the line cleared, she went to the back office and wrote down the exchange in her own words, dated it, signed it, and locked it in the safe with everything else. She thought, he knows the writ exists. He knows I have the records. He doesn't know how much I've put together about the routing system, but he's getting close to deciding I'm a problem regardless of what I specifically know. She thought, I have 23 days until the hearing. She thought about writing to Silas. She didn't because a letter could be read, and because she wasn't sure what she would say that would be useful rather than simply frightening, and she was not going to send Silas a frightening letter without something actionable attached to it. She went back to the window. Silas rode in on Friday in weather that shouldn't have had a person on horseback in it, the kind of wind that came across the flat Kansas plain with nothing to slow it down for 30 miles and hit you like something with a personal grudge. She saw his horse at the rail from the window and had the coffee poured and the second cup ready before he made it through the gate. He came to the window looking like a man who'd decided the weather was not his problem, and the weather had disagreed. His coat was carrying 2 days of plains grime, and his hat was sitting at an angle that suggested it had been fought for. "Bad week on the road?" she said. "Eli's down with something. I've been running the east fence myself." He picked up the coffee with both hands, which meant they were colder than he'd admit. 3 posts down on the ridgeline. Wind. Just wind? He looked at her over the cup. "I'm not sure," he said. 2 of them could have been wined. The third one, the anchor post. That one's been set 11 years. It doesn't come down in wind. She absorbed that. "Did you tell Dowd?" "Dowd can't prove anything, and we both know it." He set the cup down. "How are things here?" She told him about Reeves. She kept it factual and short. She watched his face go through something controlled and careful while she talked, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He's trying to find out what you have before the hearing," he said. "I know. If he decides you're a liability regardless of what you have, I know that too," she said. He looked at her with a directness that was more than the directness he usually had, which was already considerable. "Vivian, I need you to tell me honestly. Are you safe?" She held his gaze. "The records are legally protected. The writ is in place. Reeves threatening my freight scheduling doesn't change that." "That's not what I asked." She paused. "I'm being careful," she said. "That's also not what I asked." She looked at him for a moment. He had a way of asking things that didn't let you redirect, which was both useful and occasionally inconvenient. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think so. I think as long as the records are protected and Hartwell has my statement, I'm more useful as a witness than as a problem. Reeves is testing edges, he's not the kind of man who acts without authorization. He'll go back to Price and report that I'm not moving, and then Price will decide what to do. And what will Price decide? I don't know, she said honestly. That's what I don't know. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the wind working on the platform roof. Then he said, I want you to write down everything, every conversation with Reeves, every odd thing at the station, dates, times, exact words if you can remember them. Send copies to Hartwell. I already have, she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but a recognition, like a man who's been watching someone carry something and has just understood how long they've been carrying it without being asked. Of course you have, he said. I've been doing this longer than you've been watching, she said, and there was something almost like lightness in her voice when she said it, which surprised her slightly. He very nearly smiled. Fair point. The eastbound came around the bend and Silas turned for it. She'd stopped trying not to notice the automatic turn. It was simply part of Friday. And she watched the train come in and the passengers move through. A family with a lot of luggage. An older man traveling alone. A woman about Vivian's age who stepped off and was immediately embraced by someone waiting on the platform, a long embrace, unhurried. Silas watched that without any visible expression. When the train pulled out, he turned back. You know what I realized this week, he said, and his voice was different, lower, less managed, the voice of a man who had been alone with a thought long enough that it had changed into something he couldn't quite keep contained anymore. I've been coming here every Friday for 3 years, and I told myself it was for Adeline, and it was. I'm not saying it wasn't. He stopped, looked at the tracks. But this fall, somewhere in here, Fridays started being about something else too, and I'm not sure when that happened. She didn't say anything. She waited the way she'd learned to wait with him. Not passive, but present, available. I'm not explaining this well, he said. You're explaining it fine, she said. He looked at her then with something that was open in a way she hadn't seen from him, unguarded in the specific way of a person who is not used to being unguarded and is not entirely comfortable with it, but has decided to do it anyway because not doing it has started to cost more than doing it. I don't know what this is, he said. I don't know what to call it. He stopped again, jaw tight. It's been 3 years. I didn't think You don't have to know what to call it, she said. I feel like I should. Why? He thought about that. Actually thought about it, which she appreciated because the easy answer was readily available and he didn't reach for it. Because not knowing feels like I'm doing something without being honest about what I'm doing, he said. And I don't operate that way. You're being honest right now, she said. I'm being incoherent right now. That's a form of honesty, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the empty coffee cup, and then at the platform, and then somewhere out past the cottonwood. She would have liked you, he said quietly. It was not a small thing to say, and she recognized that. Tell me about her, Vivian said. Not the Friday part. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. Then, she could not abide a lie, not even a polite one. She'd rather make a situation uncomfortable than let a lie sit in it. A pause. Drove me crazy sometimes. Also made her the most trustworthy person I ever knew. He cleared his throat. She kept a garden because she said the soil didn't lie to you. You put in work, you get back exactly what you put in. Not more, not less. Another pause. She was right about that. The garden on the south side, Vivian said. He looked at her. You remembered. You mentioned it to Sheriff Dowd when you wouldn't sell. Yeah. He turned the empty cup in his hands. I planted it again in the spring after I didn't know what else to do. The seeds came up. They always do. The platform had emptied out. The December light was doing something long and pale over the plains to the west. The particular winter light that made the flatland look like it went on forever because it more or less did. Vivian, he said, after the hearing. After this, Price situation is sorted, one way or the other. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it's not ready to be yet. Then don't say it yet, she said. He looked at her. We have 20 days until the hearing, she said, and a great deal of complicated business between now and then. Say it after. Something in him loosened. Not relief. It was more specific than that. It was the particular loosening of a man who has been given permission to wait, which was the thing he was actually best at. "Same time next week," he said. "Don't let another fence post come down," she said. He put on his hat and walked to the gate, and she watched him go the way she watched him go every Friday, which was with more attention than she would have admitted to 6 weeks ago. The letter from St. Louis arrived on a Monday. She'd almost forgotten about it. She'd written back in November saying she was interested in the position, but not yet in a position to commit to a timeline. Careful, non-committal language she'd learned in years of professional correspondence. And the response had taken long enough that she'd stopped expecting it. But there it was, on the Monday after the second full week of December, sitting in the mail batch she sorted each morning, her name in the formal hand of a railway company secretary. The regional management position was still available. The salary had increased. They wanted the right person for the role and were prepared to demonstrate that. They needed a decision by the 1st of February. She read it twice. She set it on the desk. February 1st was 2 weeks after the hearing. She sat with that for a moment. Then she folded the letter and put it in her skirt pocket and went back to the freight manifests, because the freight manifests were what was in front of her, and the letter required more thinking than she had time for on a Monday morning. She did not tell Silas about the letter. She told herself this was because there was nothing to tell yet. She hadn't decided anything. She was still thinking. And she believed this was true. She also knew, in the more honest part of herself, that she didn't tell him because telling him would make the decision harder in a direction she wasn't sure she wanted it to be harder in. She was 31 years old. She had excellent qualifications and a ruined ledger system she'd rebuilt from scratch, and a locked safe containing documents that could potentially end a land fraud scheme. And she had not, in the past year, made a single decision based on what someone else needed from her. She thought, "I should not start now." She thought, and yet, she put the letter away and did not look at it again for 4 days. The third week of December was when things moved. Hartwell sent a wire on Tuesday. Additional documentation had surfaced in the county recorder's files suggesting that the false survey had been notarized by an official who had since relocated to Colorado, and that the notarization date did not match the date on the original filing. It was exactly the kind of technical irregularity that was invisible unless you were looking for it and devastating once found. Hartwell was filing a supplementary challenge. On Wednesday, Sheriff Dowd rode out to the Rocking G and found that someone had cut the wire on Silas's south fence, adjacent to the creek. The creek access was the most valuable single feature of the Rocking G's 340 acres. Without creek access, cattle operations in a dry summer became extremely difficult. The cut wire was deliberate, clean cuts, not breaks, and done at the 3 specific points that would require the most labor to repair before winter deepened. Dowd couldn't prove it was Price's men. Dowd wrote it up anyway. Silas repaired the fence himself in 2 days, working from first light to last. Eli was still sick. He did it alone. On Thursday, Vivian found the third notation. She'd been back through the original freight records twice and thought she'd extracted everything relevant. But on Thursday, she went back a third time because something about the September entries had been nagging at her. A specific parcel number that appeared twice with slightly different freight codes. And this time she found what she'd missed. A transfer authorization signed not by a freight agent, but by a land assessor's deputy, a man named Voss, whose office was in Dodge City, and whose signature on a freight transfer authorization made no procedural sense whatsoever. A land assessor's deputy had no business signing freight transfers. The only reason that signature would be on a freight record was if the freight itself was land-related documentation, and the only reason to route land documentation through a freight system instead of official county channels was to avoid the official record. She copied the page 3 times. 1 copy in the safe, 1 in the oilcloth packet in her traveling case, 1 in a sealed envelope she addressed to Hartwell's office and put in the outgoing mail before Tully arrived Thursday morning. She also, on Thursday evening, sent a short note to Silas. Not about the records, she didn't put specifics in written messages anymore, but asking him to come to the station window before the platform opened on Friday. 1:30 instead of 2:15. He was there at 1:15. "You found something," he said before she could speak. "A land assessor's signature on a freight transfer," she said quietly. "A deputy named Voss. It connects the freight routing directly to the property documentation. It's not just irregular freight anymore. It's a chain of custody for falsified land records. He stood very still. That's enough for the hearing, he said. It's enough for considerably more than the hearing, she said. Hartwell needs to know before January 14th whether he wants to expand the scope of the complaint. This isn't just your boundary claim anymore. If Voss signed multiple transfer authorizations, how many other ranchers has Price bought out in the last 2 years? In this county, 7 that I can confirm from freight records. He looked at her with an expression that was doing several things at once. Anger, the cold kind that doesn't move around the face much, and something that was close to sick, and underneath all of it, something that was simply the recognition of a thing you'd suspected but hadn't had words for being confirmed. 7 families, he said. At minimum, she said. The records I have access to only cover Red Hollow routing. If Price is operating the same system through other stations, then it's not one man's land scheme, he said. It's a system. Yes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, wire Hartwell today. Already did, she said. Last night. He looked at her. Vivian, I know, she said. You need to be careful. If Price finds out how much you've assembled before the hearing, he already knows I've found something. He doesn't know the scope. How long until he does? She thought about it honestly. I don't know. Voss is in Dodge City. If Hartwell contacts him and Voss tells Price's people, how long before the hearing? 20 days. Silas put his hat on the counter. He ran a hand over his face in the particular way of a man who is calculating something he doesn't like the numbers of. I want you to move the copies, he said. Not just the oilcloth, everything. Get them out of this station and out of your room and send them somewhere Price can't reach. Hartwell has copies. Hartwell's office is in Dodge City, and Price has people in Dodge City. She hadn't thought of that. She sat with it for a moment. Where? She said. There's a lawyer in Wichita named Aldous Pierce, he said. Knew him before. He was a friend of my father-in-law's. He's got no connection to Price, no connection to this county. I trust him. You trust him, or you trust that he has no connection to Price? Silas looked at her. Both. She nodded slowly. I can put originals on the Saturday eastbound. Sealed envelope, personal courier delivery. I'll pay the courier. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said, with the particular tone of a man who doesn't argue about this kind of thing. She let it go. The platform was beginning to fill for the regular 247. She could see the usual Friday crowd filtering through the gate, the farm couple who came every second week, an older man with a trunk, a young woman traveling alone with a hat box that was clearly more important to her than her other luggage. Silas, she said. He looked at her. The letter from St. Louis. She hadn't meant to say it yet. She'd meant to wait until after the hearing, as she'd told herself 4 days running, but the words came out with the directness that things have when they've been held too long. The regional management position, they've offered it to me. Deadline is February 1st. He didn't move. His hands were flat on the counter. His face did something careful. That's a good position, he said. It's an excellent position, she said. More than this station pays. Significantly more. A pause. Will you take it? She looked at him. I don't know yet. He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him weighing something. The thing he'd started to say 2 Fridays ago and stopped. The thing she'd told him to wait on. She watched him decide not to push it, which was both right and somewhat difficult to watch. All right, he said. I haven't decided, she said. I know. It isn't simple. I know that too, he said, and his voice was even, and there was nothing in it she could object to except the evenness itself, which cost him something, she thought. She thought it cost him more than he showed. The eastbound came around the bend. He turned for it. She let him. She watched the train arrive and the passengers come and go, and she watched him watch the windows with the old, careful attention. And she thought about St. Louis, about good pay and advancement, and the clean purpose of a new start somewhere without complicated freight manifests, and men whose pleasantness didn't reach their eyes. She thought about a garden on the south side that always came back in spring. She thought about how the distance between Red Hollow Crossing and St. Louis was not 12 miles. When the train was gone and the platform was quiet, he turned back. Be careful with the copies, he said. Saturday Courier. Don't put your name on the envelope, just Aldous Pierce, Wichita. I know how to send a package anonymously, she said. I know you do, he said. And then quieter. That's not really what I'm worried about. She looked at him. I know that too, she said. He picked up his hat. He walked to the gate. He didn't look back this time, which told her something about where he was putting the saint, Louis Thing, and how much effort that required. And she stood at the window for a moment after he'd gone, feeling something she didn't have a clean word for. Not guilt, not quite, but adjacent to it. The particular weight of holding two true things that pull in opposite directions. Saturday, she sent the package. Anonymous envelope, sealed twice, Aldous Pierce's address in Wichita, paid courier, no name on the return. She watched the courier go and felt a small loosening she hadn't expected. The relief of having the copies somewhere else, somewhere out of reach of writ amendments and safe keys and men who tested edges. Sunday was quiet. Monday brought Cal Reeves. He didn't come to the ticket window this time. He didn't come to the freight desk. He came in through the freight entrance at the back, which was technically within his rights as an authorized freight customer, and went directly to Tully's office. She heard them through the wall. She couldn't make out words, but she could make out the rhythm of the conversation, and the rhythm was wrong. Tully's voice higher and more compressed than usual, Reeves's voice even and unvarying as a man reading from a list. It lasted 11 minutes. Then Reeves came out through the main room, looked at her directly for the first time without the pleasant performance, just looked. The flat assessment of a man who has received instructions and is deciding how to implement them. He left without speaking. Tully came out 30 seconds later. He stood in the doorway to the back office. His face was the face of a man who has just been told something he would rather not have been told and is now calculating what it costs him to be honest about it. He knows about Pierce, he said. She went very still. He knows a package went to Wichita Saturday, Tully said. He doesn't know what's in it. How does he know about the package? Tully looked at the floor. The courier works for 2 outfits. She breathed in, breathed out. All right, she said. Vivian. He looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who has been weak in one direction for too long and is not sure he has enough left to be strong in any direction. Price is going to file a counterclaim on the freight records. His lawyer is arguing the preservation writ was improperly obtained. He's going after the judge's authorization. Can he do that? His lawyer thinks so. Hearings in 3 days. Not the January 14th hearing, a different hearing. A preliminary hearing on the writ itself, on the legal standing of the preserved records, on whether the evidence Vivian had spent 2 months assembling would be admissible or simply gone. She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up the station's wire key and sent a message to Hartwell's office. Then she picked up her pen and wrote down the time and Tully's exact words and the length of Reeves's visit and locked it all in the safe. Then she stood at the counter in the empty station and looked at the platform through the window. The bare cottonwood, the weathered bench, the track running east and west into the flat winter distance. And she thought about 23 days becoming 3 days, and about the very specific patience of a man with enough money to keep changing methods until one of them worked. She thought, I have put too much into this to let it disappear. She thought, I need to be in Dodge City before that writ hearing. She thought, without quite planning to, I need to tell Silas. She took her coat off the hook. She told the freight handler to hold the desk until Tully came out. She walked to her room, packed the oilcloth packet into her coat lining, and went to the livery stable. She had never ridden 12 miles to the Rocking G. She had never had reason to. She had reason now. The horse was a reliable bay, the liveryman called Patient, which she chose to take as an accurate description rather than a hopeful one. And the road west was frozen solid and straight, and the winter sky overhead was the particular pale blue of a day that was cold enough to be serious about it. She rode. 12 miles in December with the plains wind against you is not a short ride. She was 40 minutes out before the first cluster of ranch buildings came into view, and she understood from the look of the place, the repaired fence lines, the patched barn roof, the smoke from a chimney suggesting someone still lived here and still meant to, that whatever Price had done to the Rocking G, it had not broken the man inside it. She rode through the gate. A dog she hadn't met announced her arrival. A young man came from the barn. Eli, she thought, recovered from his illness, and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who recognizes a face from description but not from meeting. Miss Hart, he said, which confirmed it. Is Mr. Granger here? In the barn. He was already moving. I'll get him. She dismounted. She stood in the yard of the rocking G for the first time, looking at the house, the outbuildings, the south side where the garden would be when spring came. The ground there was covered in the frosted remnants of last year's growth, brown and bent by winter, but the structure of it was still visible if you knew what you were looking at. The planned rows, the careful placement, the bones of something that came back every year because it had been planted with that intention. She heard his boots before she saw him. He came out of the barn and stopped when he saw her. His face moved through several things quickly. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. "Price is filing a motion to void the preservation writ," she said. "Preliminary hearing in 3 days, and he knows a package went to Wichita." Silas looked at her for a moment. He looked at Patient, the bay, who had dropped his head and appeared to be trying to locate something edible in the frozen yard. "Come inside," Silas said. "You need to warm up, and we need to think." She followed him into the house, and this house was the house of a man living alone who was not entirely comfortable with being alone. Not messy, but sparse in a way that spoke of someone who'd stopped bothering with the parts of home that only matter when you're making them for someone else. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove doing its job, a shelf with 3 books and a lamp. On the south windowsill, a single clay pot with something green in it, small and improbable in December. She looked at it. "From the garden," he said. "I bring something in every winter. Don't ask me why." "I know why," she said. He looked at her. She sat down at the table and opened her coat and took out the oilcloth packet and laid it between them. And they began to work out what could be done in 3 days. 2 people at a kitchen table in a cold December, with a small green thing on the windowsill and the planes pressing close on every side in 23 days that had just become 3. It was not comfortable. It was not smooth. They disagreed twice about which documents to prioritize, and once about whether Tully could be trusted to testify voluntarily or needed Hartwell to compel him. And Silas made coffee that was stronger than anything she'd have called drinkable under other circumstances. And she drank it without commenting because it was hot and she was cold, and there wasn't time for anything that wasn't useful. But they worked, and the work was good, and somewhere in the middle of it she looked up from the copied pages and found him looking at her with an expression she recognized now. The unguarded one, the one that cost him something to show. And she thought that whatever she decided about St. Louis, she was going to have to decide it honestly and soon, because some things didn't wait for hearings to be resolved, and some distances got shorter the longer you refused to measure them. She looked back down at the papers. "The Voss signature," she said. "That's the one Hartwell needs to lead with." "Agreed," he said. They kept working. Outside, the December light went from pale blue to pale gold to gray, and the planes held still in the cold the way they always did, indifferent to what happened on the small human scale of tables and documents and decisions not yet made. And the green thing on the windowsill stayed green, stubbornly, the way some things did when they'd been planted by the right hands in the right soil at the right time. They rode to Dodge City the next morning. It was not planned that way. The plan had been for Vivian to take the mail coach and Silas to follow separately, the way they'd done in December, keeping the appearance of 2 people with separate business at the county seat. But when she'd stood up from the rocking G kitchen table at 8:30 and said she needed to get Patient back to the livery before dark, Silas had looked at the oilcloth packet and then at her and said, "I'll ride with you to Red Hollow tonight and we'll take the coach together in the morning." She'd started to say it wasn't necessary. He'd looked at her with the particular patience of a man who was not going to argue about this. She'd said, "All right." They rode the 12 miles back to Red Hollow in the dark with a 3/4 moon giving enough light to keep the road. And they didn't talk much because the wind was making conversation impractical, and because there was something about riding in the dark on a cold December night with a person you'd just spent 3 hours working through documents with that didn't require talking to be companionable. She was aware of that. She thought he was aware of it too. At the livery, she handed Patient off, and Silas waited with both horses while she went to her room and changed her coat and checked the traveling case. The oilcloth was where it belonged. The secondary copies were in her coat lining. She came back down and they walked to the rooming house porch, and she said, "Coach leaves at 6. "I'll be here at 5:45, he said. He rode back to wherever he'd arranged to spend the night. She didn't ask, it wasn't her business, and she went inside and slept 4 hours, which was not enough, but was what was available. Hartwell met them at his office door at 9:30, looking like a man who had also not slept enough, which was reassuring in its own way because it meant he understood the urgency. He looked at the oilcloth packet on his desk, and then at Vivian. "The Voss signature," she said. "September freight transfer, parcel number 714. The authorization is in a land assessor's deputy's handwriting on a freight document. I have the original still in the station safe and 3 copies elsewhere." Hartwell picked up the copied page and looked at it for a long time. "Voss retired in October," he said. "Moved to Colorado." He set the page down. "That's either coincidence or Price tidying up." "Does it matter which?" Silas said. "For the writ hearing, no. For the January 14th challenge, yes. If Voss can be located and deposed, his testimony about what he authorized and why would be significant." Hartwell was already writing. "What's their argument for voiding the preservation writ?" "Tully told me Price's lawyer is claiming the writ was improperly obtained," Vivian said. "That Hartwell. That you didn't have standing to petition Judge Egan directly." "They're arguing procedural error," Hartwell said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It's the right move. If they can void the writ on procedure, the originals become unprotected and they can request access through Tully as station manager. Tully pulls them, they disappear, and we're left with copies whose chain of custody can be challenged." He looked at her. "You anticipated this." "I sent copies to Wichita," she said. "Aldous Pierce." Hartwell looked at Silas. "Aldous Pierce is an excellent choice." "He's a good man," Silas said. "He'll hold them." "The writ hearing is tomorrow morning at 10, Hartwell said. "I need you both there. Miss Hart, your testimony about how the records were discovered and preserved is essential. If we can establish that the preservation was initiated in good faith by an authorized station employee acting within her professional responsibilities, we undercut the procedural argument." He paused. "Can you testify to that clearly?" "I can testify to exactly what I did and when I did it," she said. "I found discrepancies in freight records during the course of normal account reconciliation. I secured them in the station safe because they appeared to require legal review. I sought legal counsel independently." She caught herself before saying Silas's name, which would complicate the chain of professional independence she was trying to establish. "I acted within my responsibilities as station clerk." Hartwell nodded slowly. And you never removed the originals from the safe?" "Never. The originals are still there, under the writ." "Good." He stood. "I'll need 2 hours to prepare the counterfiling. There's a hotel on 2nd Street. Granger, you know it. Get some breakfast and be back here at noon. We'll go through the testimony this afternoon and be ready for 10 o'clock tomorrow." They went. The hotel on 2nd Street had a dining room that smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and it was warm in the specific way of a place that has been heating itself against a Kansas winter long enough to have gotten good at it. Vivian ate eggs and bread and drank 2 cups of coffee, and Silas ate something and drank coffee, and for a while neither of them talked about the hearing or the writ or Harlan Price. "How's Eli?" she said. "Better. Back on the fence line yesterday." He turned his cup in his hands, the same gesture she'd watched at the station window for months, hands needing something to do while the rest of him was still. "He asked about you. He's met me once. I may have mentioned you, more than once." She looked at him across the table. There was something almost uncomfortable about seeing him in this setting rather than across a ticket counter. The width of the table between them instead of the width of a window frame. No platform, no train to orient toward. Just a dining room and the December light coming through glass, and 2 people who had been finding reasons to be careful with each other for 2 months. "Silas," she said. "I know," he said. "I haven't decided about St. Louis." "I know that too. I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. "I came here to be somewhere quiet, to not have complicated things for a while." "How's that working out?" he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when something was almost a smile. "Poorly," she said. He looked at his coffee. "I'm not going to ask you to stay. I want to be clear about that. That's not something I'm going to do." "Why not?" He looked up. "Because you came here to make your own life," he said, "not to be part of mine. And whatever this is. Between Fridays, I don't think it works if I try to hold it in place by asking you not to leave." She looked at him for a long time. "That's a very correct thing to say," she said. "Doesn't mean it's easy to say," he said. "No," she agreed. I expect it isn't. A silence that was not uncomfortable. Tell me what you want, she said. Not what you think is right. What you actually want. He was quiet for long enough that a man at a nearby table ordered his meal and received it before Silas answered. I want you to stay, he said, simply. No performance around it. I want to find out what this is when it's not in the middle of a land fraud case. I want to take you out to the rocking G in spring and show you what the garden looks like when it's not frozen. He stopped. I want to find out if the thing that happens on Fridays means what I think it means when it's not, when there's no crisis to work through together. She sat with that. Those are honest things, she said. I told you I don't operate any other way. I know. She turned her own cup. I told you I haven't decided. I know. I'm telling you I heard what you said. He nodded once. They finished breakfast and went back to Hartwell's office. The writ hearing was at 10 the next morning in a courtroom on the second floor of the county building, wood-paneled and cold despite the stove in the corner working at full capacity. Judge Egan was a spare man of 60-something with a face that had heard a great many arguments and was not inclined to be impressed by any of them on principle. Price's lawyer was a man named Kellner from Wichita, which told you something about the resources Price was deploying. You didn't bring a Wichita lawyer to a county writ hearing unless you were serious about winning it. Kellner argued procedural standing for 40 minutes. He was precise and well-prepared, and he had 3 cases in precedent that gave Egan something real to consider. Hartwell argued professional good faith and public interest for 35 minutes, and introduced Vivian's testimony, and introduced the Voss signature, and introduced the fact that copies of the preserved records now existed in 3 separate legal offices in 2 cities, which meant that voiding the writ would not in fact eliminate the evidence, but would only affect the chain of custody for the station originals. Egan asked Vivian 4 questions. She answered them in the same direct, unadorned way she'd been answering questions her entire professional life. What she found, when she found it, what she did with it, why. No elaboration, no drama, just the facts in order. Egan recessed for 20 minutes. When he came back, he sustained the writ. He did it in 8 sentences, the last of which was, a station clerk acting within her professional scope, who identifies what appear to be fraudulent records and takes reasonable steps to preserve them, has not overstepped any procedural boundary this court recognizes. Motion denied. Motion. Kellner's face did something controlled and expensive. Silas, sitting beside Vivian on the hard courtroom bench, let out a breath that she felt rather than heard. She did not let herself feel too much yet. The January 14th hearing was still ahead. The writ surviving its first challenge was necessary, but not sufficient. But it was something. Outside on the courthouse steps, Hartwell shook both their hands and said, 14 days. I'll have the expanded complaint ready in a week. I'm including the 7 other acquisitions. This is bigger than one ranch's boundary line, and I want the court to see that from the start. He went back inside. They stood on the steps in the December cold. 7 families, Silas said again. He said it the same way he'd said it the first time, with that particular weight. At minimum, she said. He looked out at the Dodge City Main Street, the traffic of a county seat going about its business in the cold, none of it aware of what had just been decided upstairs. Some of those people sold because they thought they had to, he said, because the papers made it look like they had no choice. I know. If the acquisitions were based on false documentation, that's for the court to determine, she said. That's what January 14th is for. He looked at her. You're very steady. I'm very tired, she said. Those are not the same thing, but they look similar. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. They took the afternoon coach back to Red Hollow. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the longest and the most ordinary at the same time. The station ran. Freight moved. Tickets were sold. Vivian reconciled the December accounts, which were complicated by the weather delays and the rerouted shipments, but which ultimately balanced, as accounts did when the person doing them was careful. Tully came in, did his job, didn't mention Price or Kellner or the writ hearing. He seemed to be in the process of deciding something about himself that he hadn't finished deciding. She didn't push it. Cal Reeves did not come back. This was either because Price had pulled him off station surveillance after the writ was sustained, or because the approach had changed. She didn't know which, and the not knowing was its own kind of pressure. The low-grade alertness of someone who knows a threat hasn't disappeared but can no longer see where it's positioned. She thought about St. Louis more than she wanted to. She thought about spring gardens and creek-fed grassland, and a man who showed up the same way every week for 3 years because showing up was the truest language he had. She thought about what it meant to make a decision for your own life versus a decision towards someone else's, and whether those two things were necessarily in opposition or whether that was a false distinction she'd been carrying since Kansas City when she'd learned that putting someone else first cost you a position and a reference letter and 6 months of her own certainty. She thought, that was a different situation. She thought, all situations feel different when you're inside them. Friday came with the particular quality of a Friday in the last week before a significant event. Everything normal on the surface, everything charged underneath. Silas arrived at 2:15. Blue shirt, same bench sightline, coffee already on the counter. He came to the window and picked up the cup and said, 4 days. 4 days, she agreed. Hartwell's ready? He wired yesterday. The expanded complaint covers all 7 acquisitions, the Voss authorization, the freight routing system, and the false survey. He thinks the judge will consider the full scope. She paused. He also said Price's lawyer has been trying to locate the Wichita copies. Silas set the cup down. Pierce? Pierce confirmed this morning that he has them in his office safe and has declined all requests for access without a court order. She watched him absorb this. Hartwell says trying to access those copies before the hearing may actually work in our favor. It demonstrates Price's awareness that the documents are damaging. Price isn't stupid, Silas said. He knows the game changed when the writ held. Then what does he do? He goes back to what he knows, Silas said. Money and patience. He looked at his coffee. Or he panics. Rich men don't panic well. They have too many options to choose from. She thought about that. The platform was quiet. It was a slow Friday, the cold keeping casual travelers home. The cottonwood was down to its winter bones, and the track ran straight east and west into a sky the color of pewter. Silas, she said. He looked up. After the hearing, she said, whatever the outcome, I need to give St. Louis an answer by February 1st. He was very still. I know, he said. I haven't... She stopped. I want to be honest with you. You've never been anything else, he said. I'm thinking about staying, she said. I'm not saying I've decided. I'm saying it's where my thinking is. He looked at her. He had the face of a man who is receiving news he'd hoped for and is not allowing himself to believe it completely because hoping for something and having it are different things, and he'd learned that particular lesson in a way that left marks. Why? He said. Not pushing, asking, the way he asked things when he actually wanted the answer. Because I came here to be somewhere quiet, she said. And it turns out quiet isn't what I was missing. I was missing purpose, work that matters, people who... She stopped. Tried again. I was missing being somewhere that felt like it required me. He was quiet for a moment. Red Hollow requires you, he said. Red Hollow's freight system certainly does, she said. Something moved in his face. That's not all I meant. I know, she said. I know what you meant. The eastbound came around the Cottonwood Bend with its particular noise, the advance rumble, then the whistle, then the full weight of it settling onto the platform reality. He turned. She watched him turn. She watched his face do the thing, the old alignment, the habit of hope, and she watched it hold this time without the shadow behind it that had always been there before. Or maybe the shadow was there, it was always going to be there, but it was smaller today, or she was seeing it more clearly, the way you see things more accurately when you stop looking past them at something else. The train came in. A man stepped off carrying a leather satchel and looking around the platform with the lost expression of someone arriving somewhere for the first time. A young couple got on with too much luggage and not enough coordination. An older woman in a good coat stood at the window for a ticket south. Vivian sold her the ticket. When she looked back at the bench, the platform was clearing, and Silas was still watching the windows of the departed train with the particular stillness that she understood now was not only grief but also the habit of a faithful man. A man who had decided something was worth showing up for and had never stopped showing up regardless of what it cost. He turned back to the window. He looked at her in the way he looked at her when he wasn't managing it. I want to show you the garden in spring, he said. I meant that. I'd like to see it, she said. It's not, it's not much, objectively. It's about 40 square feet of kitchen garden and some flowers Adeline put in the back row because she said practical things needed something impractical beside them. That sounds right to me, she said. He turned the cup in his hands. There's room for more. On the west side where the soil gets the afternoon light. I never planted it out because... He stopped. I never got around to it. She looked at him steadily. Are you asking me to plant a garden, Silas? I'm saying there's space, he said. What you do with that information is your business. She felt something that was more complicated than warmth. The particular thing that happens when you recognize a feeling you've been carrying without naming it. I'll think about the space, she said. He almost smiled. This time it actually reached. January 14th arrived the way significant days do, no differently than any other day in terms of the cold gray morning light and the sound of wind and the smell of coffee, but with a particular quality of weight that the morning knew it had to carry. They rode the 6 o'clock coach together. They did not pretend they were traveling separately. Whatever prices people had been watching, the time for that kind of caution had passed. The Dodge City Courthouse had more people in it than the December writ hearing. Word had gotten out. 7 families' worth of land acquisitions challenged in a single complaint had a way of generating attendance. Vivian counted 9 men in the gallery she didn't recognize, none of them wearing the clothing of county officials or lawyers, all of them with the watchful, invested look of people with something at stake in the outcome. Silas recognized 2 of them. Hartwell, he said quietly, finding the lawyer in the crowd. Who are those men? The ones on the right side of the gallery, 2nd and 4th row? Hartwell looked. The one in the gray coat is Paul Messner. He sold to Price in September. The younger one, brown vest, is his son. He looked further. I don't know the others. I do, Silas said. That's Will Teague. He sold in August, lost his north pasture and his water rights in the same transaction. His jaw was doing the controlled thing. Hartwell, are these men here because they know what's in the complaint? I sent letters to all 7 families last week, Hartwell said. I told them their transactions were being reviewed as part of a fraud investigation. I told them nothing else. And they came anyway, Vivian said. They came anyway, Hartwell agreed. The judge was a woman named Caldwell, which was not what anyone in the room had expected, including Kellner, who managed his surprise professionally, but not quite invisibly. She was 50, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead and brought down only when she was reading, which she did frequently, and with obvious impatience for anything that wasted her time. Kellner led for Price Consolidated. He was good. He'd had 2 weeks to sharpen his procedural argument after losing the writ hearing, and he'd used them. He argued that the freight records were internal station documents, not subject to judicial review without proper administrative authorization. He argued that the survey challenge was based on a technicality in the notarization dating that could be explained by clerical error. He argued that 7 land transactions conducted between consenting parties with signed documentation could not be retroactively invalidated by the discovery of freight discrepancies. He was there for an hour and 20 minutes. Some of it was quite good. Hartwell led for 45 minutes. He introduced the Voss signature and its implications. He introduced the shadow routing system, explaining it in terms clear enough that Judge Caldwell's expression shifted from impassive to attentive about 6 minutes in, which Vivian recognized as a significant change. He introduced the pattern of acquisitions and the falsified notarization date and the connection between Price Consolidated's freight operations and the legal documentation for those acquisitions. Then he called Vivian to testify. She sat in the witness chair in her good dress, the one she'd brought from Kansas City, the dark blue one she'd worn to 3 separate professional reviews and 1 funeral. And she answered Hartwell's questions in the same way she'd answered Judge Egan's 4 questions a month ago. Direct, factual, in order. How did she find the discrepancies? What did she do? When did she do it? Who did she tell and when? Then Kellner cross-examined. He was trying to establish that she had a personal relationship with Silas Granger that compromised her professional independence. He was not wrong that a relationship existed. He was wrong about what it compromised. Miss Hart, Kellner said, you rode to Mr. Granger's ranch on the evening of December 21st, correct? Correct, she said. And you shared the contents of the freight records with him at that time. I shared the existence of a legal development affecting the writ with him, she said. He is a party to the legal proceeding. I did not share the freight records themselves. But you had previously shared information about the records with him. I told him I had found discrepancies that might be relevant to his boundary challenge, she said. I told a party to a legal proceeding that evidence potentially relevant to that proceeding existed and had been preserved. That is not a conflict of interest. Kellner shifted. Are you personally acquainted with Mr. Granger outside of the station context? We live 12 miles apart in a county of 340 people, she said. Yes. A small sound from the gallery. Would you characterize your relationship as, I would characterize my relationship with Mr. Granger, she said, as that of two adults in a small community who have spoken on multiple occasions. I would characterize my actions regarding these freight records as those of a professional doing her job accurately. Those two things are not in conflict. Kellner tried two more angles. She answered them the same way. He sat down. Hartwell called Tully. This was the part Vivian had not been certain of. Tully had agreed to testify voluntarily. She knew this. Hartwell had confirmed it. But agreeing in the safety of a December conversation and sitting in a witness chair in a room where Harlan Price's lawyer was 6 feet away were different things, and Tully was, as she'd assessed many months ago, a man whose backbone was variable under pressure. He sat down. He looked at Kellner. He looked at the gallery. He looked at the floor. Then he testified. He testified clearly and without significant deviation about the freight transfers, about the routing system, about the conversations he'd had with Price's people, about what he'd been told and what he'd not asked questions about. He was not a heroic witness. He hedged twice and backtracked once on a date. But he was a truthful witness, and truthful witnesses, even imperfect ones, have a quality in a courtroom that Vivian had seen before. They sound like people telling the truth. It is a distinct sound. Kellner's cross-examination of Tully was aggressive. Tully held on. Not brilliantly, but adequately, which was all that was needed. Judge Caldwell recessed for an hour. In the hallway outside, Vivian stood with her back to the wall and her hands in her coat pockets and let herself feel the tiredness she'd been holding at bay since 6 that morning. Silas was talking to Paul Messner, the man in the gray coat who'd sold his land in September, and she could see from across the hallway what that conversation looked like. Two men standing close, Messner's face doing something painful, Silas listening with the contained stillness that was the specific quality he brought to things that mattered. Hartwell appeared at her elbow. "How do you feel about it?" she said. "Caldwell's attentive," he said. "That's what I want. An attentive judge." He paused. "Your testimony was excellent. I told the truth." "In a courtroom, those are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not," he said. Today they were. She looked across the hallway at Silas and Messner. "What happens if Caldwell rules in Price's favor?" she said. "We appeal," Hartwell said. "We have Pierce's copies. We have Tully's testimony. We have the Voss signature. We keep going." He paused. "But I don't think we're going to need to appeal today." She looked at him. "Caldwell asked me 3 questions during my presentation," he said. "All 3 were about the pattern, not the specific documents, but the pattern across all 7 acquisitions. When a judge is asking about pattern, she's thinking about the full scope of the injury." He straightened his coat. "We wait." They waited. Caldwell came back in 58 minutes and ruled for 40. She granted the boundary challenge on the rocking G. She voided the false survey. She declared the notarization defective and ordered the county recorder to restore the 1871 boundaries. Then she went further. She ordered a full administrative review of all 7 Price consolidated acquisitions in the county. She impounded the freight records from Red Hollow Station, originals and the Wichita copies both, as evidence in that broader review. She referred the matter of Deputy Voss's unauthorized signature to the State Land Assessor's Office for investigation. She did not rule on the acquisitions themselves. Those would require separate proceedings, she said, and she was naming a special master to oversee them. But she made clear, in the particular language judges use when they want the room to understand something without it becoming a reversible statement of prejudgment, that 7 land transactions conducted using a fraudulent documentation system were not transactions she expected to survive review. Kellner was already writing when she finished. In the gallery, Paul Messner put his hand over his face for a moment. Silas sat very still beside Vivian. She could feel the stillness of him, the way a man holds himself when something large has just shifted and he's not sure yet that he trusts it to have actually shifted and not shift back. She put her hand over his on the bench between them. Not for any reason she needed to explain, just because it was the right thing to do at that moment and she was tired of being careful about the right thing. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the room began to clear. Outside the courthouse. The afternoon had gotten cold in the specific way of a January day that started cold and found more cold to add by mid-afternoon. Messner shook Silas's hand and then Vivian's, and his son shook their hands, and Will Teague shook their hands, and two men she didn't know, and Silas might or might not have recognized, shook their hands, and Hartwell told everyone the review process would take months, and not to expect swift resolution and to not do anything on their property in the meantime that assumed a specific outcome. The handshaking took a while. When it was done, they were standing on the courthouse steps in the January cold with the street traffic going past, and the sky doing something complicated with what might become snow by evening. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "The review could take until fall." "I know." "Price will fight every step of the acquisitions review." "I know that too." He looked at her. "But the Rocking G's mine. That's settled today. My line is where it's always been." He paused. "And the system that was propping Price up is in front of a special master now. He can fight the review, but he can't fight it with false documents anymore because the documents are impounded." Another pause. "He can't keep doing what he was doing. That's what today means." She nodded. He looked at her for a moment in the January light. "When do you need to give St. Louis an answer?" "February 1st. That's 16 days. "Yes." He put his hat on against the cold. He looked at the street. "I'd like to take you somewhere that isn't a courthouse, or a station, or a coach," he said. "Before February 1st. "Where?" "The Rocking G, not on business, not to look at documents." He paused. "I'd like to show you the place the way it is when it's just what it is." She considered that. "This weekend?" she said. Something in his face settled into something that was more than relief. "Saturday," he said. "Eli can handle the ranch for an afternoon." "It's January," she said. "The garden won't be much to look at." "I know," he said. "Come anyway." She looked at him. The blue-shirted rancher who rode 12 miles every Friday for 3 years and would probably have ridden 12 miles for 30 more if the right question hadn't been asked on a rainy November afternoon. The man who had fought for his land not because he was certain he'd win, but because walking away from it was a thing he couldn't do without losing something he couldn't name. She understood that. The thing that couldn't be named. She understood it more specifically than she would have expected to when she stepped off a train in October with the wind stealing her hat, and the sign over the door reading 340, as if that number were something to be proud of. It was, she thought, when the right 340 people were in it. "Saturday," she said. She went to the Rocking G on Saturday. It was cold, and the sky was the pale blank of a January afternoon, and the garden on the south side was exactly what she'd expected, brown and frozen and shaped like a promise, rather than anything currently growing. She stood at the edge of it for a while and looked at the structure of it, the careful design of someone who knew what she was doing and expected to come back to it, and she thought about what Silas had said at the kitchen table in December. She planted it to come back. He stood beside her. "The back row," he said, pointing. "Those are the flowers she added, planted over 2 springs because she couldn't decide the first year." What did she decide on? Black-eyed Susans and something blue I never learned the name of. She told me 3 times. I kept forgetting. She sounds like someone who didn't mind that. He thought about it. She minded. She pretended not to, but she minded. He looked at the frozen rose. She was patient with my failings, but she noticed them. "That's the honest version of love," she said. "It is," he agreed. She looked at the west side, the unpainted space of ground that got the afternoon light, which was not currently doing much with the afternoon light because the afternoon light was the thin January variety. But she could see the potential of it. The soil looked like it would take things. The drainage looked right. "What would you put in?" he said. She looked at him. He was asking a real question. She looked back at the ground. "Vegetables first," she said. Practical things. Then something tall on the north edge to cut the wind, she thought. And something that blooms in August, when everything else is exhausted. He was quiet for a moment. That's specific, he said. I've thought about it, she said. He looked at her. When? He said. December 22nd, she said. When I was sitting at your kitchen table going through freight manifests and you had that clay pot on the windowsill. He made the sound that was almost a laugh, except this time it actually became one. Brief, real, the kind of laugh that comes out because it can't help it. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It was a better sound than she'd expected, and she wanted to hear it again, which was information. They walked back to the house, and he made coffee that was only slightly less brutal than the December variety, which she was beginning to think was simply how he made coffee and perhaps was not going to improve, and she drank it sitting at the kitchen table looking at the green thing on the windowsill that was still improbably alive in January. She thought about February 1st. She thought about St. Louis, the clean slate of it, the salary, the position, the absence of complicated freight manifests, and land fraud, and men who rode 12 miles every Friday in the blue shirt. She thought, I have been running from complicated things for a year, and the running has not made them simpler. It has only made me tired. She thought, the things worth staying for are usually the things that are hardest to name. She looked at the green thing on the windowsill. She looked at Silas across the table, holding his coffee the way he always held it, both hands against the cold, and looking at her with the expression he had when he wasn't managing it, the open one, the one that cost him something. She thought, I know what I'm going to do. She didn't say it that afternoon. Some decisions needed to be made before they were announced, and she had not quite finished making this one. There were still the threads of it to pull through, the practical considerations, the letter to write, the conversation to have with Tully about the position becoming permanent. But she sat at his table and drank his terrible coffee and looked at the green thing on the windowsill, and something settled in her chest that had been unsettled since February, since losing her mother, since the Kansas City transfer and the lonely train to Red Hollow with the wind stealing her hat. Something that felt, after a very long time, like arriving somewhere. Not because someone had asked her to, because she had looked at the ground on the west side of the garden and seen what it could hold, and she wanted to be the one to plant it. Some choices were that simple. Some choices only looked complicated from the outside. She wrote the letter to St. Louis on a Sunday evening in the last week of January, sitting at the small table in her room above the tack supply with the lamp turned up and the wind doing what the wind did in Kansas in January, which was everything it wanted to. She didn't labor over it. She'd been composing it in her head for 2 weeks, and the words were ready, and the decision behind them was steady in a way she recognized. The particular steadiness of something that had been thought through completely and was no longer subject to revision. She thanked them for the offer. She told them she was declining. She told them she had found a position that suited her well in Red Hollow Crossing and intended to remain. She said nothing else because nothing else was their business. She sealed it. She addressed it. She set it on the corner of the table where she would not forget to post it in the morning. Then she sat for a while with her hands in her lap and the lamp burning and the wind outside, and she did not feel regret, which was the thing she'd been watching for, the way you watch for a symptom you've been warned about. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more durable, the particular stillness of a person who has made the right choice for the right reasons and knows it. She was 31 years old. She had buried both her parents in the same year and left a city she knew for a town she didn't, and found, in the process of trying to be somewhere uncomplicated, one of the more complicated situations of her professional life. She had spent 4 months reconstructing fraudulent freight records by lamplight and testifying in county courthouses and riding 12 miles on a horse named Patient in December cold. She had also, somewhere in the middle of all of that, stopped running from the things she'd been running from. She did not think of this as a happy ending. She thought of it as an honest beginning, which was both harder to come by and more worth having. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep. Monday she posted the letter. Tuesday she spoke to Hiram Tully. He was in his office when she knocked, actually working, which he'd been doing more consistently since the hearing. The written Caldwell's ruling had done something to Tully that she hadn't quite anticipated. They'd relieved him of the particular weight of a man who has been complicit in something and is waiting to be found out. The finding out had happened. The consequences were, so far, less severe than he'd feared. Hartwell had indicated Tully's voluntary testimony would be considered in any disciplinary review, and the result was a man who was, cautiously, trying to be better at his job than he'd been when being better at his job had felt too dangerous to attempt. "I'd like to make my position permanent," she said, "if it's available." He looked at her. "I assumed you'd be leaving," he said, "after the St. Louis thing." "I declined the position." He absorbed that. He looked at his desk. He looked at the window. He looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. He nodded once, slowly. "The freight system needs rebuilding from the ground up," he said. "After the impoundment and the review, when the records come back, we'll need a full reorganization." "I know," she said. "I've started the outline." He made a sound. "Of course you have." He leaned back in his chair. "The position is yours if you want it. Always was. I just didn't think you'd stay." "I'm staying," she said. She went back to the accounts desk. She was there 15 minutes when she heard Tully come out of his office, pour himself coffee, and go back in. He didn't say anything else. Neither did she. She thought, this is what it looks like when things get better. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Just incrementally, imperfectly. One reasonable person at a time, making slightly better decisions than they made before. It was not glamorous. It was how most things actually improved. The Price Consolidated Review proceeded through February at the pace of official processes, which is to say slowly and with a great deal of paper. The special master appointed by Caldwell was a methodical man named Forsyth, who had the institutional patience of someone who had spent 30 years in land law and was not going to be rushed by anyone. He reviewed each of the 7 acquisitions separately. He requested additional documentation from county offices in 3 different jurisdictions. He deposed 4 people, including Deputy Voss, who had been located in Colorado and who, once faced with the documentation Hartwell had assembled, made the particular decision of a man who realizes that loyalty to someone like Price is only worth anything as long as Price can protect you, and Price was currently unable to protect anyone, including himself. Voss's deposition took 2 days. Hartwell sent Vivian a wire afterward that said simply, he confirmed everything. Harlan Price did not attend any of the review proceedings personally. He had lawyers for that, expensive ones, and they fought every document request and every procedural step with the thoroughness of people being paid by the hour to be thorough. But the thing about a pattern of fraud documented across multiple freight records, multiple county filings, and multiple land transactions, with a corroborating witness who had first-hand knowledge of the authorization process, is that fighting it piece by piece does not make it disappear. It makes the pieces more visible. Every challenge Price's lawyers mounted drew more attention to the specific documents they were challenging, and each document led to another, and the pattern Vivian had begun to see in August ledger pages by lamplight in October became, by March, a finding that the special master described in formal language as systemic fraudulent misrepresentation in the acquisition of real property. The language was dry. What it meant was not. It meant 7 families had sold land they did not have to sell, under false legal pressure manufactured by a man with enough money to manufacture it. It meant 4 of those 7 families had a legal path to reclaiming what they'd lost, the transfers being sufficiently documented as coerced to support reversal. The other 3 were more complicated. They had reinvested the proceeds, moved on, built different lives, and the law was not going to make those lives unbuilt. But they received settlements, negotiated through Forsyth's office over the spring, that acknowledged what had been taken. Harlan Price paid those settlements. He paid them through lawyers and paper and the particular silence of a man who has been publicly exposed and has chosen financial resolution over prolonged legal spectacle. He did not apologize. Men like Price did not apologize. They settled and they relocated and they found other counties in other states and they started over with the same patience and the same methods and the hope that no one in the new place would look too carefully at the freight records. Vivian knew this. It was one of the things she thought about sometimes, late, when the work was done and the lamp was burning low. That the specific evil of patient, money-backed fraud is not that it cannot be stopped, but that stopping it in one place does not stop it everywhere. Price was not in prison. He was in Colorado or Nebraska or wherever men like Price went when a county became inconvenient. She thought about this without resolution, which was where it deserved to sit. Some things didn't resolve cleanly. Some victories were local and partial and had to be enough because they were what you had. What she had was this. The Rocking G's boundaries were restored. Paul Messner had his North Pasture back. Will Teague was in negotiation for his water rights. The freight records were reorganized and clean, and she understood every line of them. The station ran better than it had in years, possibly better than it had ever run, because she was good at her job and she had stopped performing something else while she did it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, a considerable amount of something. February became March. Became the particular moment in Kansas when the ground decides it's done being frozen and the decision is irreversible. Vivian had been to the Rocking G 3 times since the January Saturday. Once for practical reasons, twice not. The practical reason was bringing Silas copies of the Forsyth Review's preliminary findings, which Hartwell had sent to her address. The not practical reasons were harder to describe efficiently, and she had stopped trying to describe them efficiently, because efficiency was a quality she applied to work and not to everything. On the second not practical visit, she'd walked the west side of the garden with him in the thin February light, and he'd said, "Still thinking about it?" And she'd said, "I've ordered the seeds." And he'd been quiet for a moment, and then said, "What kind?" And she'd told him, and he'd nodded, as if she'd said something that confirmed a thing he'd been waiting to have confirmed. On the third visit, she'd helped him repair the last of the south fence posts that the winter had worked loose. She was not incompetent with a post driver, a fact that appeared to genuinely surprise him, and she allowed herself to enjoy the surprise. And afterward, they'd sat on the back step of the house in the cold, and he'd talked about Adeline for a while. Not the Friday version of talking about Adeline, not the careful, preserved grief version, but the ordinary version. The version that was just a man talking about a person who had been real and present and difficult and funny and gone. She listened. She didn't try to fill the space or redirect it or make it comfortable. She let it be what it was, him trusting her with the whole of something instead of the portion that fit the occasion. That was different from everything that had come before it. That was the difference between knowing someone and knowing them. She thought about her parents. She told him about her father's inability to admit when he was lost while driving, and her mother's habit of humming when she was reading something she disagreed with, and her father's woodworking, her mother's opinions about curtain fabric, the specific way they'd argued and the specific way they'd made it up, and the specific way she still sometimes turned to say something to one of them before she remembered. He didn't say it gets easier. He said, "The specific things are the hardest to lose," and she said yes, and they sat on the step in the cold until the cold became untenable and went inside. These were not grand things. They were the ordinary materials of two people deciding to trust each other with the parts that were hardest to carry alone. There was nothing clean about it and nothing perfect. And there were moments when it was awkward in the way that real things are awkward. A wrong word, an assumption that didn't land, a silence that meant different things to each of them and had to be navigated out of carefully. They were both people who had learned to be guarded in ways that didn't entirely serve them. They were both imperfect in ways the other was still learning the shape of. But they were learning. That was the honest version of what was happening between them. Not a story about two people falling perfectly into place, but a story about two people doing the difficult work of becoming known to someone, which is one of the hardest things a person can undertake, and also one of the only things worth undertaking. March brought the first week of warmth that actually held, the kind of warmth that didn't apologize in a retreat overnight. The ground at the Rocking G thawed in the way Vivian had been watching for since January, first soft on the surface, then workable below, then ready in the particular way that soil signals readiness to a person who's been waiting on it. She came on a Saturday with the seeds she'd ordered from a catalog in February, wrapped in the same oilcloth she'd used for the freight copies, which she thought was appropriate. Eli saddled her horse for her when she arrived and said, in the manner of a 22-year-old who is trying not to make something obvious while making it completely obvious, "He's been up since 5. "Doing what?" she said. "Turned the west bed," Eli said. "Twice." She looked at the garden. He had turned it twice. The west side was worked soil, dark and clean, with the particular quality of ground that had been prepared by someone who knew what they were doing and had wanted to get it right. Silas came out of the barn. He looked at her, then at the oilcloth package, then at her again. "You brought them," he said. "I said I'd ordered them," she said. "I know, I just..." He stopped. He was doing the thing where he was not entirely sure what to do with good news, which she had come to understand was a habit of a man who had gone a long time between instances of it. Come look at what I turned. They spent the morning in the garden. She planted the practical things first, the vegetables, in the rows she'd planned on paper in February, in the order that made sense for the spacing and the light. He worked beside her without being asked, following her lead on the layout because she'd thought it through and he hadn't, and he knew the difference between the two situations. He asked questions when he didn't understand something. She answered them without condescension, which she thought he appreciated. Around mid-morning, she put in the tall things on the north edge, the wind cutters, as she'd described them to him in January, plants that would need a season to establish before they did what they were supposed to do, which was the nature of things worth planting. Then the late season blooms on the south edge, next to Adeline's black-eyed Susans and the blue thing, whose name Silas had forgotten 3 times. She planted them close but not crowding, adjacent. Each one with its own space and its own roots, but close enough that by August, when everything else was at its most exhausted and the Kansas summer had done its worst, they would be in full bloom together. She thought Adeline would have understood that. She thought she might even have approved. Silas was looking at the finished bed. "The blue ones," he said. "The ones she planted. I finally looked them up." He paused. "They're called bachelor's buttons." Vivian looked at them. The small dry remains of last year's, dormant but present, the way things were present when they'd been planted by someone who wanted them to come back. "Bachelor's buttons," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I was looking at the garden with the expression she'd seen on the courthouse steps in January and on the back step in February and at the kitchen table in December. The open one, the one that cost him something, the one that was not yet anything he'd named out loud, but was as legible as print to anyone who was paying attention. She was paying attention. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "Ask me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, thinking, the way he thought, all the way through. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I wasn't particularly good at it even before. I wasn't a man who said things easily. Adeline used to say I had to be asked directly for anything that mattered, or I'd carry it until it became a problem." "She wasn't wrong," Vivian said. "No," he agreed. "She wasn't." He turned toward her fully. He had dirt on his hands and his hat was pushed back from the morning's work, and he looked like a man on his own ground in his own life, which was exactly what he was. "I'm asking you," he said, "whatever this is, whether we keep building it, whether we find out where it goes. I'm asking you formally, plainly, with full knowledge that I'm not easy to live with, and the ranch needs work, and last winter nearly broke the operation. I'm asking you." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have led with the part about not being easy to live with," she said. "I thought the full disclosure was appropriate." "It was," she said. "Yes." "Yes to which part?" "Yes to building it," she said. "Yes to finding out where it goes." A pause. "And I'm not particularly easy either, for the record. I reorganize things without being asked, and I work late, and I have opinions about freight manifests." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you for 5 months." 6, she said. "You forgot October." He almost smiled. He actually smiled. The full version, the one that reached. He crossed the turned earth between them in 2 steps, and she had a moment to think that this was not how she'd imagined it. Standing in a March garden with dirt on her knees and her hair coming loose from its pins, and everything imperfect and real, before he was close, and the thinking part became unnecessary. He held her face in both hands like something he was careful with. She put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating at a rate that suggested he was not as composed as he appeared, which she found privately reassuring because her own was not particularly steady. "I'm not asking you to be her," he said, quiet, serious. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I'm not trying to be." "You're—" He stopped. "You're entirely yourself, and that's the thing that—" He stopped again, and she thought, this is what he meant about not being good at saying things. Not that he didn't have them, that they were large enough to resist the size of words. "I know," she said again, softer this time. He kissed her once, briefly, the way of a man who is not going to rush the first important thing. Then he leaned his forehead against hers, and they stood in the March garden in the morning light with the turned earth around them and the plains running flat and enormous in every direction. And it was not a perfect moment. It was a real one, which was considerably harder to come by and worth so much more. The last Friday of March, Silas rode to Red Hollow Crossing at the usual time. He'd been riding to Red Hollow Crossing every Friday for 3 years and 4 months, and the habit of it was so deep in his body that he suspected he'd be doing it when he was 80, if he was lucky enough to reach 80. Some habits outlasted their original purpose and became their own purpose, which was fine. That was how humans worked. They found reasons, and then the reasons changed, and the showing up remained. He bought the platform ticket at the window. Vivian stamped it and slid it across the way she always did. Their fingers touched on the exchange the way they sometimes did now, unhurried, without performance. "Busy week?" he said. "Forsyth's final report came through," she said. "It's done. All 7 acquisitions reviewed, 4 reversals confirmed, 3 settlements finalized." She paused. "Price's lawyers filed a response yesterday. Hartwell says it's procedural noise. The report stands." He absorbed that. "Messner gets his pasture back," he said. "In 60 days, legally. The paperwork is moving." He nodded slowly. He thought about Paul Messner's face in the courthouse gallery in January, the hand over his face when Caldwell ruled. He thought about Will Teague. He thought about the 5 men he didn't know personally, and their families and their land, and what it meant to have something taken from you, and then have someone hand it back, imperfectly and late, but back. He thought, justice moves the way justice moves. Not fast and not clean, but it moves. "What will you do with the morning?" she said. She knew his schedule well enough by now to know he'd arranged his Friday differently than usual. She'd heard him tell Eli on Thursday that he'd be in town until early afternoon. "There's something I need to do before the train comes," he said. She looked at him, asking without asking. "I'll be back before 2:47, he said. He walked out to the platform and stood for a moment. The morning was doing something fine, the particular March morning that feels like an argument won, the sky clear and the light coming in at an angle that made the platform boards look almost golden. The cottonwood at the track's edge was putting out its first small leaves, the tentative ones, the ones that came before the tree committed to the decision. He reached into his shirt pocket. The platform ticket from the first Friday after Adeline died was there. He'd kept it in every blue shirt pocket for 3 years. He hadn't planned that. The first week he'd simply forgotten to throw it away, and by the second week keeping it had become a kind of promise he was making to himself without exactly examining what he was promising. He held it in his hand. It was worn soft at the folds, the ink rubbed faint in the corner, the cardstock thinned by 3 years of being carried close. It had been through summer heat and winter cold and the specific weathering of a man's chest pocket on a working ranch, and it still held together, the way things held together when they were made to last. He thought about Adeline, not the grief of her, the specific her, the way she laughed running down a platform, the way she'd held the blue shirt up in the dry goods and said, "That's the one." The way she'd known things with a certainty that he'd found exasperating when he disagreed with her and essential when he didn't. The way she'd planted a garden to come back. He thought, she would have liked Vivian. He'd said that once, out loud, and he'd meant it, and he still meant it. They were different women in most respects, and alike in the respects that mattered. They both had a preference for honest things over comfortable ones, and they both knew the difference between a practical row and an impractical flower, and understood that you needed both. He thought, I have honored this. I came back every week. I did not let it slip away before I'd said goodbye properly. He thought, I don't know what goodbye properly looks like, but I know it isn't coming here forever and never planting the west side. He walked to the bench on the south side, third from the water barrel, where you could see the full length of the track as it bent around the cottonwood grove and straightened out before the crossing. He sat. He sat there for a while in the March morning with the ticket in his hand and the empty track running east in the clear light and the sound of the platform doing what platforms do when no train is present, settling, breathing, being quiet. He was not waiting for anything. That was the difference. He was not waiting. He was here, fully and specifically here, in the present moment of a March Friday with a good morning and good soil turned on the west side of a garden, and a woman who stamped tickets with 2 fingers and had opinions about freight manifests, and had ridden 12 miles on a horse named Patient in December to tell him something was wrong before he knew something was wrong. He sat with all of that. Then he unfolded the ticket and looked at it for a long time. "All right," he said quietly. "Not to the platform, not to the air. To Adeline, who was not there and had not been there for 3 years and 4 months and would not be there, and who he had finally, after all of it, stopped expecting. Not because she wasn't worth expecting, because expecting was not the same as honoring, and he understood the difference now. He had not always understood it. "All right," he said again. He folded the ticket once more, carefully, the same fold. Then he stood, walked to the edge of the platform, and set it down on the rail. The old, worn, faded ticket, precisely placed, on the iron rail where trains came and went, and kept coming and kept going and moved things from where they were to where they needed to be. He walked back to the window. Vivian was watching him from the ticket side. She'd seen. She didn't say anything immediately, and he appreciated that. There was no appropriate immediate thing to say, and she was too smart to manufacture one. Then she said, "Coffee's cold. I'm sorry." "It's fine," he said. She pushed it across the counter. He picked it up. "How long until the 2:47?" he said. She checked the clock behind her. "Hour and 10. "Then I'll wait," he said. She looked at him. "Inside or out?" she said. He considered the question. He looked at the platform, the bench, the track, the cottonwood putting out its small tentative leaves. He looked at Vivian on the other side of the window, in the station building she'd reorganized, and the job she'd chosen to keep, and the town that had not been what she'd expected and had turned out to matter to her anyway. "Inside," he said. She opened the half door that separated the ticket area from the main station, and he came through it, and they stood on the same side of the counter for the first time in 6 months of Fridays, which was something she had not let herself notice she wanted until she had it. He was taller than she'd registered, standing this close. "You can see the track from the window," she said. Practical. "I know," he said. "If you want to watch for the train, I'll watch from here," he said. They stood at the window together and watched the track and the cottonwood and the march light on the platform. And when the eastbound came around the bend at 2:47, they watched it come in side by side, and they watched the passengers move through, and neither of them said anything particular. And it was not a sad thing, and not an entirely happy thing either, but something more durable than either. It was an honest thing, which was the only kind worth having. The train departed east, the platform settled. "Same time next week?" she said. "Same time," he said. They were married in October on a Saturday because Saturday was a day neither of them worked, and because October in Kansas had a quality of light that did what light did best when it was paying attention. The ceremony was at the Rocking G, in the yard, not in any formal hall, because Silas had no interest in formal halls, and Vivian had enough experience with formal things to know that the informal version of something true was almost always better than the formal version of something performed. Eli stood up with Silas. A woman named Clara, who had become Vivian's closest friend in Red Hollow Crossing across the summer, stood with her. Hiram Tully came and stood in the back and looked at the proceedings with the particular expression of a man who is trying not to be moved and is failing. Hartwell rode up from Dodge City. Aldous Pierce sent a letter from Wichita with a bottle of very good whiskey. Paul Messner was there with his son, both of them in their good coats, standing near the garden fence. Will Teague came with his wife. Most of Red Hollow came, because that was what small communities did when something worth showing up for happened. They showed up, with food and noise and the particular warmth of people who know they are witnesses to something that will be a story their children hear. The garden on the south side was in its last good week before the season turned. The black-eyed Susans going to seed, Adeline's blue ones done for the year, and on the west side the late-season blooms that Vivian had put in last March, standing up in the October light precisely as she'd planned, because she had planned them carefully, and the planning had been accurate. They stood in front of those flowers, which was Vivian's decision, and which Silas had agreed to without having to think about it, because there was room for what had been and what was. And only people who hadn't thought about it carefully enough believed otherwise. The words were brief and direct. They said what they meant. They did not perform at each other. Vivian thought about standing in a station in October and chasing a hat 3 yards down the platform in the wind and looking up at a sign that said 340, as if that number were something to be proud of. She thought, it is. When the right 340 people are in it. Silas thought about a blue shirt and a folded ticket and a bench on the south side of a platform where you could see the full length of the track. He thought about the particular cost of showing up for something for a long time without knowing whether showing up was enough. He thought about a rainy November afternoon and a cup of black coffee set beside him without being asked, and a question that was not asked with any agenda other than the honest desire to know. Who are you waiting for? He thought, I was waiting, and then I stopped waiting, and that was the harder thing, and also the only true thing, and the woman standing beside me in the October light is the reason I know the difference. He did not say this out loud. He said what he said and meant what he meant, and that was sufficient. They went to the station most Fridays after that. Not always. There were weeks when the ranch kept them, weeks when weather made the ride impractical, weeks when life intervened in the specific and mundane ways that life does. But most Fridays, in the blue shirt that was starting to show its years now, he'd bought a second one and kept it for when the first needed work, which she'd done once without telling him, and he'd noticed the careful stitching and not said anything for 2 days, and then said everything. They rode in together. She still worked the window. That was her work, and she was good at it, and she didn't intend to stop. He bought a platform ticket. She stamped it and slid it across. Sometimes their fingers touched. Sometimes they didn't. Both were fine. He sat on the bench on the south side when the train came in. She watched from the window. He didn't watch the windows the way he used to. He watched the train the way a person watches a thing that was once the center of a story and is now just part of the landscape, present, acknowledged, no longer carrying the full weight of everything. When the eastbound cleared and the platform emptied, he came back to the window. Coffee? She said. It was cold last week, he said. It's been cold every week. I know, he said. I drink it anyway. She pushed the cup across and he took it, and they stood together at the window in whatever weather Friday brought, and they talked about the week's work and the garden and Eli's various complications and whatever Hartwell had sent from Dodge City about the ongoing review proceedings. And sometimes they talked about nothing in particular, and sometimes they were quiet together in the way of people who have learned that quiet between them is not a problem to be solved. There was a Friday in the second winter when a young woman came to the window, new to the county clearly, carrying more than she could comfortably manage, with the particular look of someone who has arrived somewhere and is not yet sure it was the right somewhere. She bought a ticket. She looked at the man sitting on the south bench with his coffee and his stillness and his attention fixed on the distant track. She leaned toward the window. Who's he waiting for? She asked. Vivian looked at Silas. He was watching the bend in the track where the cottonwood grove thinned and the line straightened before the crossing. Not the waiting posture, not exactly, but the look of a man who has learned to be present to a thing rather than expecting it. She looked back at the young woman. He's not waiting anymore, she said. He's just watching. The young woman accepted this and moved on. Vivian watched her go and thought about the distance between waiting and watching, which was not a small distance, and which had taken a man she loved 3 years to cross, and which was one of those things that could not be rushed or faked and could only be arrived at honestly, from the other side of all the showing up that had to happen first. She thought about what she understood now that she hadn't understood when she asked the question on a rainy Friday in November, that waiting and showing up look identical from the outside, and that the difference between them is entirely interior, and that some people never find it, and that the ones who do usually find it, not by stopping, but by discovering that what they thought they were waiting for had already arrived, and they just hadn't yet learned to call it by its right name. She thought about Adeline, whom she had never met, who had planted a garden to come back and had not come back and whose garden came back anyway, which was not the same thing but was something. She thought about February 1st, the letter she'd written and posted and not regretted. She thought about a bay horse named Patient and 12 miles of frozen road in December and an oilcloth packet and a man who turned the west bed twice before she arrived. She thought about all the ordinary things that were the actual material of a life. The cold coffee and the mended fence posts and the Forsyth report and the October light on the garden and Eli's various complications. And she thought that this was what people didn't tell you about the life you chose, that it was mostly made of ordinary things, and that the choosing was not one large moment but 1,000 small ones, most of them undramatic, many of them inconvenient, all of them yours if you had the sense to recognize what you were being offered. That was the truth of it. Not a smooth thing. Not a perfect thing, but a real thing, built by two imperfect people choosing each other in small ways daily, which was the only way anything real ever got built. She stamped the next ticket. She slid it across. She watched the Friday platform do what Friday platforms did, and she thought, I came here to be somewhere quiet. She looked at Silas on the bench, at the town beyond the platform, at the plains running enormous and flat and unflinching in every direction. She thought, I found something better than quiet. I found somewhere that asks something of me and is worth the asking. That was enough. In her experience, that was more than most people got, and more than she had expected when the wind stole her hat, and she looked up at a number on a sign and decided it would have to do. It had not merely done. It had, in the way of the best unexpected things, become the whole of what she wanted. And every Friday, without fail, the eastbound came in and moved on, and the platform settled, and two people stood at a window on the same side of the counter and watched the track and drank cold coffee and were ordinary together, which was the quietest and most radical thing that two people who had each been very alone could choose to be.